My name is Sydney. I am 27 years old, and I work as a forensic data analyst. After my grandmother's funeral, I did not tell my parents she had secretly left her $25 million estate entirely to me. I am so glad I kept my mouth shut. Because just 2 weeks later, the horrifying truth she revealed about my parents' past shocked me to my very core and changed my life forever. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they could break you. The scent of rain and freshly turned earth still clung to my black dress as I pulled into the gated driveway of the Sinclair estate. I had just buried Grandma Beatrice, the only family member who showed me genuine warmth. My chest felt incredibly hollow, an empty cavern of grief that I was barely keeping together. I parked near the guest house, where I paid market-rate rent every month. I just wanted to fall into bed and cry. But the universe had a completely different plan. Inside, my long-term boyfriend was frantically shoving designer shirts into a duffel bag. He froze his face, going pale. The guilty panic in his eyes gave away the entire story. He confessed right there that he had been sleeping with a junior executive for 6 months. He was moving out today. He said he could not deal with my emotional baggage, especially with my grandmother passing away. I stood paralyzed, watching the man I thought I would marry walk out the front door without making eye contact. My analytical brain that extracted hidden financial data for a living simply shut down. I walked back out onto the porch, needing fresh air. But there was no time to grieve. Standing on the manicured lawn waiting for me like predators were my parents. Donovan and Camilla Sinclair stood shoulder to shoulder. My mother still wore her expensive black morning suit, looking completely furious. My father had his arms tightly crossed, his expression void of any paternal sympathy. My mother marched up the steps and shoved a stiff piece of paper directly into my chest. It was a formal, legally binding lease termination notice. I stared at the bold black letters printed at the top of the page, trying to make sense of what I was reading. "You have until 8 tonight to clear out your belongings," my mother said, her voice as cold as ice. "The demolition crew is arriving first thing tomorrow morning. We are bringing in bulldozers to knock this old structure down." I looked from the paper to her perfectly contoured face. "Demolition?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Mom, I just got back from the cemetery. I pay rent here. We have a legally binding contract. You cannot just hand me an eviction notice on the day we buried Grandma Beatrice." My father stepped forward, interrupting me with the aggressive tone he reserved for hostile board meetings. "Your sister Blair and her husband Kendrick are expecting a baby. They need proper accommodations when they visit the main house. We are knocking down this outdated guest house to build a custom nursery and a fully equipped suite for their live-in nanny. Family priorities have shifted, Sydney. You need to be realistic and make way." I felt a sickening twist in my gut. My younger sister Blair, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life, was pregnant. And because of that, my parents were literally rendering me homeless on the worst day of my life. They were prioritizing a future nanny over their own grieving daughter. "Dad, you cannot do this," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "I just caught my boyfriend packing his bags to leave me. I am completely exhausted. I have nowhere else to go on such short notice." My mother sighed heavily, rolling her eyes as if my sudden homelessness and ruined relationship were just minor inconveniences to her busy schedule. "You always have to be so dramatic, Sydney," she sneered. "You are 27 years old. You should have bought your own house by now anyway, instead of renting from us like a dependent teenager. Blair is stepping up and expanding the Sinclair legacy. You are just standing in the way of progress. Pack your things and go." The sheer cruelty of her words knocked the remaining breath out of my lungs. There was no discussion, no empathy, no consideration for the fact that I was actively paying them $2,000 a month to live in this space. It was a calculated, ruthless power play designed to remind me exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. I was at the very bottom, beneath even a hired nanny. "If you are not off this property by sunset," my father warned, "I will call security and have you escorted away for criminal trespassing." He turned his back, dismissing my existence, and offered his arm to my mother. Together they walked back toward their massive mansion. I did not cry. I simply loaded my heavy suitcases into an Uber and rode away. Within 2 hours, I had buried the only family member who genuinely loved me, discovered my partner's devastating infidelity, and been ruthlessly evicted. They desperately wanted to break me. But as my shock transformed into burning anger, my phone suddenly rang. It was Elias Thorne, the estate attorney for my grandmother. "Sydney, we have a massive problem," he said, his voice frantic. "Your parents just filed an emergency injunction to freeze the entire trust. They submitted a court petition claiming you are mentally unstable and defrauded Beatrice on her deathbed." My forensic mindset instantly clicked back into high gear. They had no idea what kind of war they had just started. I lowered my phone from my ear, letting Elias Thorne's terrifying warning echo in my mind. An emergency injunction. My own parents were weaponizing a 5-year-old therapy file to freeze $25 million, declaring me mentally incompetent. My analytical brain rapidly compartmentalized the shock, turning raw betrayal into calculated data points. I needed to leave the property immediately to secure my legal defense. I grabbed the handle of my largest suitcase, but before I could drag it toward the curb, a pristine white Tesla Model X swerved onto the gravel driveway. The vehicle deliberately angled itself, blocking the path of the Uber I had just ordered. My younger sister Blair stepped out wearing a designer cashmere coat that cost more than my entire forensic software setup. Placing a protective hand over her perfectly flat stomach, she adopted the exaggerated posture of a fragile, expectant mother. Her eyes darted to the boxes stacked on the grass. A cruel, victorious smirk spread across her face. Blair did not offer a single word of condolence regarding Grandma Beatrice. Instead, she let out a sharp laugh, pointing at my luggage. "Look at this mess," she announced to the empty yard. "I told Mom and Dad you would drag your heels about moving out. We need the contractors to start measuring the guest house for the nursery by tomorrow morning. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Sydney." The passenger door closed with a quiet thud. Kendrick, my brother-in-law, stepped onto the gravel. As the CEO of a rising financial tech startup, Kendrick usually commanded a room with effortless authority, but today he stood stiffly, avoiding my gaze. He shifted his weight, adjusting his expensive watch, clearly uncomfortable with the hostility radiating from his wife. As an African-American man who built his corporate reputation on integrity, his silent complicity in my eviction felt glaring. He knew this ambush was unethical, but he chose the path of least resistance. Before I could maneuver my suitcase around their electric vehicle, the crunching of gravel signaled the return of my parents. They flanked Blair, forming a unified front of hostility. My father held a leather folio tight against his side. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from the folio and shoved a silver pen toward my chest. "Since you are breaking your lease without notice, we are enforcing immediate penalties," he stated. "You owe us for the inconvenience and the sudden renovation costs. But we are willing to be generous. Sign this waiver and we will consider your debt settled." I did not take the pen. I kept my hands firmly gripped on my luggage handle, letting my eyes scan the top page of the document. It was a relinquishment form. They were demanding I sign away a symbolic 5% share of Grandma Beatrice's estate. The language was deliberately confusing. My mother stepped closer, tapping a manicured finger against the signature line. "It is just a formality, Sydney," she sneered. "Beatrice always intended for that small percentage to go toward family maintenance anyway. We need the cash flow to finalize Blair's nursery expansion, and you owe us for the financial burden you have caused by refusing to vacate smoothly. Sign it now, or we will involve our attorneys to garnish your wages." The sheer desperation radiating from their demands gave them away. My forensic data training had taught me how to spot financial panic. If they had successfully frozen $25 million, they would not be extorting a symbolic 5% share on a driveway. They needed this signature for a much darker purpose. The puzzle pieces rapidly locked together in my mind. Elias had said they petitioned the court claiming I was mentally unstable. If I signed this coercive document under duress right here on the lawn, their lawyers would use it as hard evidence. They would present this signature to a judge as proof that I was erratic, easily manipulated, and fully willing to surrender my legal assets, confirming their false narrative about my mental decline. They did not just want the 5%. They were trying to manufacture my incompetence in real time. Kendrick finally cleared his throat, looking at the ground. "Maybe we should handle the paperwork later," he suggested, his voice low. "She just buried her grandmother today." Blair shot him a venomous glare, silencing him instantly. "Do not baby her, Kendrick. She is just acting stubborn because she is jealous of my baby." I looked at the four of them. My father holding the fraudulent trap, my mother vibrating with toxic entitlement, my sister bathing in her unearned victory, and my brother-in-law turning a blind eye to outright extortion. They craved an emotional reaction. They wanted me to scream or cry so they could document my instability. I gave them absolutely nothing. Maintaining a stone-cold silence, I bypassed the pen completely. I grabbed the handle of my heaviest suitcase and shoved it past Blair, forcing her to jump back. I dragged my belongings around the gleaming bumper of the Tesla and marched straight toward the waiting Uber that had finally managed to pull up to the curb. My silence shattered their control. Camilla lost her mind. She lunged forward, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical scream. "You walk away now and you are cut off forever," she shrieked, her hands balled into tight fists. "Do you hear me? You will get nothing from the Sinclair legacy. You are a defective failure." I opened the heavy back door of the rideshare, sliding into the back seat. I pulled the heavy door shut, blocking out my mother's threats. As the driver pulled away from the estate, I stared out the window, watching my family shrink in the rearview mirror. They thought they had successfully discarded me. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact motivation I needed to tear their fraudulent empire down to the studs. The heavy iron gates of the Sinclair estate vanished behind the rain-slicked windows of the rideshare. I sank back against the cold leather seat and let out a long breath. The adrenaline from the confrontation on the lawn was slowly fading, leaving behind a sharp, razor-focused clarity. I watched the sprawling mansions of my childhood neighborhood blur past the glass. My parents and my sister thought they had just won. They thought evicting me from the guest house would strip away my dignity and force me to beg for their approval. They believed that bullying me out of a symbolic 5% share of the estate would secure their financial future and fund their extravagant lifestyle. They were completely wrong. I reached deep into the hidden interior pocket of my black morning coat. My fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. I pulled out a military-grade titanium encrypted USB drive. I held it up, allowing the passing streetlights to catch its dull gray surface. It was no larger than my thumb, but it held the power to obliterate the entire Sinclair family hierarchy. Grandma Beatrice had given this drive to me exactly 48 hours before she slipped into a coma. She had called me into her hospital room, dismissed the nurses, and locked the door. Beatrice was a sharp, brilliant woman who built her fortune from the ground up. She saw right through my father Donovan. She knew his country club memberships and luxury cars were just smoke and mirrors, hiding a crumbling mountain of debt. She knew my mother Camilla cared only about maintaining a flawless social facade, and she knew that if they ever got their hands on her life's work, they would bankrupt the family within a year. So she made a choice, a legally binding, irrevocable choice. Grandma Beatrice did not leave the estate to Donovan. She did not leave a trust for my sister Blair or her unborn child. She bypassed her own son entirely. The dramatic irony tasted almost sweet in the back of my throat. My parents had just threatened to call the police to remove me from a rented guest house without realizing I owned the very ground they were standing on. The drive in my hand contained the master cryptographic keys and the digital access codes to the Beatrice Sinclair Generation Trust. The entire $25 million fortune had been left solely and exclusively to me. I ran my thumb over the smooth titanium casing. I was not the discarded defective daughter they had just mocked on the driveway. I was the sole heir to a $25 million empire. Beatrice had chosen me because of my forensic data background. She knew I had the analytical skills to protect the assets and the spine to stand up to my father when the time came. She had trusted me to be the custodian of our family's true legacy. For the first time since my grandmother took her last breath, a profound sense of peace washed over me. I felt a surge of absolute control. The grief was still there, but it was now armored in purpose. I mentally calculated my next steps. I needed to go to my secure apartment, set up my forensic servers, and begin the decryption process. Then, I would formally execute the transfer of power. I imagined the look on my father's face when the bank notified him that his accounts were cut off. I pictured my mother's perfectly contoured expression cracking when she realized the daughter she just evicted was now her landlord. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had completely flipped. I leaned my head against the cool window, letting a quiet smile touch my lips. I was safe. I was in control. The worst was over. Suddenly, the harsh ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet hum of the car engine. I pulled the phone from my purse. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dark back seat. It was Elias Thorne. Elias was Grandma Beatrice's personal estate attorney and a fiercely loyal family confidant. He was the only other person on the planet who knew the contents of the titanium drive and the true nature of the $25 million trust. I swiped the screen to answer, expecting a solemn but professional greeting to coordinate the official reading of the will. "Hello, Elias," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. "I just left the estate. I have the drive secured. We can begin the transfer protocol whenever you are ready to process the paperwork." There was no professional greeting. There was no calm coordination. "Sydney." "We have a massive problem," Elias said. His voice was completely unrecognizable. The usually stoic, unflappable attorney sounded breathless. He was practically shouting into the receiver, and I could hear the frantic shuffling of paper and the slamming of filing cabinet drawers in the background. I sat up straight, my grip tightening on the phone. The surge of control I felt just moments ago evaporated instantly. "Elias, what is wrong?" I asked. "What is happening?" "Sydney, you need to listen to me very carefully," he urged, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Your parents did not just kick you off the property. They staged that confrontation to distract you while their legal team went straight to the courthouse. They bypassed the standard probate process. They just filed an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze the entire $25 million trust." The titanium drive suddenly felt like a block of ice in my hand. "Freeze the trust." I repeated, my forensic brain trying to process the legal impossibility of what he was saying. "Elias, how is that even possible? The trust is ironclad. Grandma Beatrice made me the sole beneficiary. They have no legal standing to freeze those assets." "They do if they challenge your fundamental competency," Elias fired back. "Sydney, they submitted a sealed court petition to a sympathetic judge. They are claiming you are severely mentally unstable. They filed sworn affidavits stating you suffered a psychological break and that you actively defrauded Beatrice on her deathbed to manipulate her into changing the will." The air vanished from my lungs. The sheer audacity of their lie was staggering. "The judge signed the emergency order 10 minutes ago." Elias continued, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "The accounts are completely locked down. You cannot access a single dime of the $25 million. Sydney, they are framing you for elder abuse and fraud. If we do not fight this injunction immediately, you are not just going to lose the money, you are going to federal prison." The ride to the downtown financial district took exactly 18 minutes. I barely registered the blurring city streets outside the window. My mind was locked into survival mode, cataloging every detail of Elias Thorne's warning. I paid the driver, leaped out of the car, and sprinted through the revolving glass doors of the high-rise building. I bypassed the receptionist entirely, taking the elevator straight to the 42nd floor. I expected to find Elias pacing in his private office, surrounded by open law books and a whiteboard full of defense strategies. Instead, the secretary gave me a tight, panicked smile and pointed toward the main glass-walled conference room. I pushed open the heavy double oak doors, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was a calculated ambush. Elias sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table. His jaw was clenched tight and his hands were flat against the wood. He shot me a sharp, warning look, communicating 1,000 apologies in a single glance. He had been cornered. Lining the opposite side of the table was a wall of expensive tailored suits. 3 high-priced corporate litigators sat with their laptops open, looking like sharks smelling blood in the water. And sitting right in the center, radiating absolute arrogant satisfaction, were Donovan and Camilla Sinclair. They had beaten me here. They treated this completely like a hostile corporate takeover, and I was the target they intended to liquidate. "Sydney, please take a seat," Elias said, his voice tight with restrained anger. Opposing counsel insisted on serving these documents directly despite my objections. I did not sit down. I stood at the opposite end of the table, maintaining my physical and emotional distance. My father leaned back in his leather executive chair, steepling his fingers. He looked entirely in his element, perfectly comfortable using corporate intimidation tactics against his own flesh and blood. The lead litigator, a man with cold gray eyes and a predatory grin, cleared his throat and reached for a stack of legal papers. Before the lawyer could utter a single word of legal jargon, my mother raised her hand. She silenced the highly paid attorney with one perfectly manicured finger. Camilla wanted to take the lead. She wanted to be the one to twist the knife and watch me bleed. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. With a swift flick of her wrist, she slid the folder across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly across the vast table, stopping exactly an inch from my fingertips. I looked down at the cover. The logo of a university psychiatric clinic was stamped in the top corner. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was a 5-year-old medical file. I knew exactly what was inside those confidential pages. I remembered that specific year with painful clarity. I was 22 years old and finishing my degree. Unlike my sister Blair, who had her tuition fully funded and a luxury condo paid for by my parents, I had been completely cut off financially. I was working 3 grueling minimum wage jobs just to keep up with my staggering student loan payments while maintaining straight A's in a demanding data science program. The relentless punishing schedule had broken me down. I experienced severe burnout, chronic sleep deprivation, and crippling anxiety attacks. I had voluntarily checked myself into the campus clinic for a brief stint of therapy, just to learn coping mechanisms and keep my head above water. It was a testament to my survival and resilience, but in Camilla Sinclair's hands, it was a loaded weapon. "We know you have not been well, Sydney," my mother said. Her voice was dripping with a toxic, syrupy mock maternal concern that was entirely for the benefit of the lawyers in the room. "We know you suffer from severe psychological instability. It breaks a mother's heart to see her child struggle with such profound delusional behavior and uncontrollable anxiety." I stared at her, refusing to let my expression change. She was spinning the narrative so completely, so flawlessly, gaslighting me in real time that it was almost impressive. "It explains so much," my mother continued, sighing heavily for dramatic effect. "It explains why you would manipulate a vulnerable, dying old woman. Beatrice was not in her right mind, and you used your erratic, aggressive episodes to bully her into changing that trust. We have the medical documentation right there to prove that you are fundamentally unwell." The lead litigator leaned forward, tapping his expensive pen against the table. "The court takes elder abuse and psychological instability very seriously, Miss Sinclair," he warned smoothly. "This file establishes a documented history of mental defects. If we proceed to a full trial, this private medical history will be entered into the public record for anyone to read." The threat hung heavy in the sterile boardroom air. Camilla dropped her fake act of maternal concern and locked eyes with me. The sheer brutality of her ultimatum became crystal clear. She was weaponizing my lowest, hardest moment to destroy my current life. "You work as a forensic data analyst, Sydney," my mother stated, her tone turning ice cold. "You handle highly sensitive corporate data for top-tier global clients. Your employer requires you to maintain a pristine background check and a flawless psychological profile. What do you think your firm will do when they receive an anonymous leak of these medical files? They will consider you a severe liability and terminate you immediately. She paused, letting the threat sink in before delivering the final blow. And what do you think the press will do when we leak this to the local media? We will brand you exactly as you are. An unhinged, defective daughter who terrorized her own grandmother for cash. You will be blacklisted from the tech industry. Your career will be entirely obliterated, your reputation will be in ashes, and you will face federal fraud charges. The room was dead silent. The corporate litigators watched me closely, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. They expected tears. They expected begging. They expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of their psychological warfare and sign whatever they placed in front of me. Sign the surrender documents right now, Camilla demanded, pushing a fresh pen across the table. Relinquish your claim to the $25 million trust immediately. Sign it over to your father, or I swear to you I will leak this file to your boss before you even step onto the elevator. I stood perfectly still. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind was remarkably clear. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought a 5-year-old therapy file about sleep deprivation and student loan stress was enough to force me into surrendering a $25 million empire. I looked down at the medical file, then up at the smug, expectant faces of my parents and their predatory legal team. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, analytical, forensic side of my brain take the wheel. I did not reach for the pen. I did not reach for the medical file. Instead, I leaned across the polished mahogany wood and picked up the actual emergency injunction they had filed with the court earlier that morning. The heavy cardstock felt rigid in my hands. The lead litigator let his smug smile falter just a fraction. He had expected a sobbing child, terrified of her parents and overwhelmed by the clinical setting. He got a senior forensic data analyst examining a poorly constructed dataset. I looked at the primary affidavit my father had allegedly sworn and signed yesterday afternoon. Then I looked at the electronic filing stamp at the bottom border of the page. I flipped to the secondary document containing the supposed psychiatric evaluation. I scanned the margins, the pixelation around the digital seals, and the barcode routing numbers printed in the top right corner. I placed the documents gently back onto the table and smoothed the edges with my fingertips. When I finally spoke, my voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was the exact same clinical tone I used when briefing federal investigators on corporate embezzlement rings. You should really run your extortion material through a basic metadata scrubber before presenting it to a forensic analyst, I said. My mother scoffed, crossing her arms tightly. Do not try to bluff your way out of this, Sydney. It is pathetic. I ignored her completely, focusing my gaze entirely on the lead litigator. His gray eyes narrowed defensively. This emergency injunction was supposedly filed and stamped by the county clerk at 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I stated, tapping the bottom of the page. However, the PDF rendering artifacting on this printed copy, specifically the kerning and pixel degradation around the digital signature, indicates this document was generated using Adobe Acrobat Pro version 22.4. That specific software update rolled out globally at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon. That is exactly 5 hours after this document was allegedly finalized and filed. The litigator stiffened. The two junior lawyers beside him suddenly stopped typing on their laptops. The rhythmic clicking of keyboards ceased, leaving a heavy, dead silence in the room. I continued, my voice echoing against the glass walls. Furthermore, the cryptographic hash value printed in the electronic filing margin does not match the standard municipal server routing format. You did not file this yesterday morning. You mocked up a fake filing stamp using a third-party generator. You flattened the image layers to hide the edits and backdated the metadata to make it look like the judge signed off on an existing psychological evaluation before my grandmother actually passed away. You digitally altered a federal court document. My father shifted uncomfortably in his executive chair. She is talking nonsense. She is having an episode. Shut her down right now. But the lawyers were not looking at my father. They were staring at the documents in front of them with sudden sickening realization. "Let us talk about the supporting affidavits," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. The sworn statement from Dr. Evans, the psychiatrist who supposedly verified my current mental decline, is incredibly fascinating. I notice it was submitted via an electronic portal. If I were to pull the IP address origin for that specific digital submission, I am entirely confident it would not trace back to a legitimate medical clinic. It would trace back to the secure wireless network of the Sinclair estate, specifically to the MAC address of my father's home office desktop. "You forged a medical professional's digital signature." My mother slammed her hand flat on the table, her diamond rings clattering against the wood. "You arrogant little brat! You think you can just make up technical words and scare us into backing down." "I am not trying to scare you, Mom," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I am explaining the mechanics of your prison sentence." I shifted my attention back to the legal team, making direct eye contact with the lead attorney. Submitting digitally altered documents to a judge is perjury and fraud upon the court. Forging a medical affidavit to wrongfully freeze a $25 million estate is grand larceny. And presenting a stolen medical file to extort a signature under the threat of public defamation is a direct violation of federal blackmail statutes. As licensed officers of the court, your participation in this meeting makes you active co-conspirators in a criminal enterprise. The lead litigator's face drained of all color. The arrogant corporate shark from 5 minutes ago was gone, entirely replaced by a man staring at the very real possibility of immediate disbarment and federal indictment. He knew I was right. He knew that if I walked out of this room and handed this paperwork over to the FBI Cybercrimes Division, his lucrative career would be over before lunchtime. "Sydney, we were simply presenting a settlement option." The lawyer stammered, his voice suddenly tight and defensive. "There is no need to escalate this to allegations of fraud." "The metadata does not lie," I said coldly. "But human beings do. I can have my secure server isolate the true creation timestamps of these documents in under 3 minutes. I can prove exactly when they were altered and exactly which computer network in your law firm processed the fake filing stamps." Panic erupted on the legal side of the table. The two junior lawyers rapidly slammed their laptops shut, physically distancing themselves from the printed documents as if they were radioactive. My father, oblivious to the shifting tide, puffed out his chest. "You work for us," he barked at the lead attorney. "Do not let this unstable girl lecture you. Force her to sign the relinquishment immediately." The lead litigator stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He did not look at me. He looked at Donovan and Camilla with absolute, unfiltered rage. "Mr. Sinclair," the lawyer said, his voice trembling with barely controlled panic, "you assured me these affidavits were securely obtained and legitimately filed through proper municipal channels. You assured me the electronic signatures were fully verified by the medical clinic." "They are verified," my father lied, his face turning a dark shade of red. "She is bluffing. I am not losing my law license for you," the attorney snapped. He turned to his associates. "Gather the files, all of them. Leave the surrender waivers." "What are you doing?" my mother shrieked, standing up and grabbing her designer bag. "We pay you a massive retainer to handle her." "Handle her?" The litigator pointed a shaking finger at the conference room door. "Get out." My father blinked, stunned by the sudden command. "Excuse me, get out of my office immediately," the lawyer yelled, losing all professional composure. "Both of you. Your retainer is terminated as of this exact second. If you do not leave these premises right now, I will call building security and have you physically removed. And if the federal authorities contact this firm regarding these altered documents, we will turn over all communication records between you and this office." Camilla opened her mouth to scream, but Donovan grabbed her arm hard. He finally realized the gravity of the situation. His expensive legal shield had just collapsed, leaving him completely exposed to federal charges. His face flushed with a mixture of profound humiliation and sudden terror. He practically dragged my mother toward the double glass doors. They did not look back at me as they fled. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing them out. The three lawyers hastily packed their briefcases, refusing to make eye contact with me. They practically sprinted out of the room through a side door, leaving the forged injunction and the 5-year-old medical file sitting uselessly on the table. I was finally alone. The air in the boardroom felt completely different. The suffocating pressure was gone. I let out a long breath, rolling my shoulders to release the tension. I had not shed a single tear. I had not raised my voice. I had simply used their own digital footprints to construct a flawless, impenetrable defense. The heavy oak doors remained sealed, shutting out the chaos my parents had dragged into the building. I stood alone in the center of the vast conference room, listening to the quiet hum of the climate control system. The adrenaline that had fueled my forensic deconstruction of their fraudulent injunction slowly receded. The frosted glass door connecting to the private executive suite clicked open. Elias Thorne stepped back into the room. He had silently excused himself the moment my mother presented the forged medical file, presumably to avoid becoming a hostile witness. But he had heard every word through the intercom. The veteran estate attorney looked at me with a mixture of profound relief and undisguised awe. He locked the primary doors and triggered the privacy blinds, sealing us off from the rest of the firm. "You dismantled a team of apex corporate litigators in less than 5 minutes," Elias said, his voice tight with lingering disbelief. "I was preparing to fight a grueling multi-month probate battle, and you neutralized their entire strategy using a software update timestamp." "They left me no choice," I replied, closing my laptop. "Now we need to permanently secure the trust before my father finds a legal team desperate enough to try a different angle." Elias shook his head. "Your grandmother already accounted for that contingency." He walked over to a concealed wall panel hidden behind a framed abstract painting. He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner, and the panel slid open to reveal a hidden compartment. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, matte black steel box. He carried it to the conference table and set it down in front of me with a solid mechanical thud. It was a military-grade digital safe. The casing was composed of reinforced tungsten without a single visible seam hinge or traditional keyhole. The only interface was a recessed data port and a blank digital display. "Beatrice entrusted me with this safe 6 months ago," Elias explained, keeping his voice low. "She gave me very specific instructions. I was only to present this to you if Donovan and Camilla attempted a hostile financial takeover using defamatory tactics. She knew exactly what they were capable of, Sydney. She knew they would try to break you." I stared at the black box. My grandmother had orchestrated this entire sequence of events, predicting my parents' aggressive greed with terrifying accuracy. I pulled the titanium USB drive from my pocket and connected a secure tether cable from my laptop to the safe's recessed data port. The digital display flickered to life, requesting a cryptographic handshake. Standard brute force hacking would trigger an internal wipe protocol, destroying whatever was inside. I did not use standard methods. I bypassed the conventional interface and loaded a highly specialized decryption algorithm I had developed during my graduate research. The program was designed to unravel polymorphic encryption layers by predicting the structural shifts in the code before they happened. I executed the script. Lines of hexadecimal code cascaded across my screen, reflecting in the polished mahogany of the conference table. The algorithm engaged identifying the shifting cipher keys and systematically locking them into place. A loud metallic clack echoed through the room as the internal locking mechanism disengages. The heavy lid popped open a fraction of an inch. I lifted the tungsten lid. Nestled inside custom-cut foam was a ruggedized digital tablet. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated instantly, bypassing any operating system menus and loading directly into a secure video playback interface. A single thumbnail image sat in the center of the screen. It was Grandma Beatrice. I tapped the screen. The video began to play. She was sitting in her home library, bathed in warm afternoon light. She looked sharp, vital, and completely in command of her faculties. The sight of her made my chest tighten, but I forced myself to focus on her words. "Hello," Sydney, Beatrice said, looking directly into the camera lens. "If Elias has given you this safe, It means I am gone and my son has shown his true colors. Donovan and Camilla have undoubtedly tried to crush you to seize control of the estate. They rely on intimidation because they lack intelligence. But I raised you to be smarter than them. Beatrice leaned forward, her expression hardening into absolute steel. I did not just leave you the money, Sydney. I rigged the legal framework of the Generation Trust with a hidden structural trigger. When Donovan filed that fraudulent injunction against you, he tripped a wire. The moment those false documents were entered into the county system, a localized dead man's switch activated. The entire $25 million capital pool has been automatically routed behind an international corporate firewall. The accounts they tried to freeze are empty decoys. The real assets are locked in a sovereign offshore holding company that only you have the digital authorization to access. Elias let out a sharp breath of realization. She weaponized their own lawsuit against them, he murmured. But the money is only half the equation. Beatrice continued, her digital voice echoing in the quiet boardroom. You need to understand exactly why I cut your father out of the family legacy. You need to know the foundation of his desperation. There is a secondary file on this tablet. It contains the truth about what Donovan actually did in the winter of 1999. The video ended, cutting to a black screen. I exited the media player and looked at the tablet's desktop. Sitting in the center of the screen was a single heavily encrypted archive folder. The file name was simply Truth 1999. I connected the tablet to my laptop and initiated the transfer protocol. The encryption on this file was older, but incredibly dense. I launched my decryption algorithm and watched the progress bar inch forward. 10%, 20%. Whatever secret my father had buried over 2 decades ago was about to be dragged into the light. Suddenly, a harsh, discordant chime erupted from my jacket pocket. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen was flashing with an urgent, high-priority notification. It was an email flagged with a critical red banner sent directly from the Executive Human Resources Department of my forensic data firm. I opened the message and read the cold, clinical text. Sydney Sinclair, you are hereby suspended from all duties effectively immediately without pay. We have been contacted by federal authorities regarding a severe breach of protocol. You are currently pending a full federal investigation into corporate data theft and the unauthorized manipulation of sensitive client files. You must surrender all company hardware instantly. I stared at the glowing screen. The decryption progress bar on my laptop hit 50%. My parents had failed to steal the $25 million, so they had instantly executed a secondary catastrophic strike. They had contacted my employer and framed me for a federal cybercrime, cutting off my only source of income and attempting to destroy my professional life before I could uncover their darkest secret. The glaring red banner on my phone screen bathed the quiet conference room in a harsh warning light. A federal investigation. My parents had pulled the ultimate lever. They knew they lacked the technical intelligence to beat me in a direct digital confrontation, so they had falsely accused me of corporate cybercrimes. By contacting my employer with fabricated allegations of data theft, they had triggered an automatic corporate lockdown protocol. On the polished mahogany table, my laptop screen suddenly flickered. The progress bar for the Truth 1999 decryption ticked up to 52% and abruptly stalled. A remote kill switch command flashed across the display. My corporate IT department, acting on the federal alert, was actively attempting to wipe my local machine to comply with the investigation. I slammed my hand onto the keyboard, terminating the active connection and yanking the power cord from the wall. The progress bar froze completely, locking the files in digital purgatory. The panic that washed over me was cold and absolute. The proprietary decryption algorithm I was currently running was not a standalone application. It was inextricably tethered to my primary forensic server array. That massive physical hardware tower was not sitting safely in Elias Thorne's office. It was sitting on a desk in the living room of the Sinclair guest house. Without that specific physical server, I could not finish decrypting Beatrice's final message. More importantly, I could not run the diagnostic traces required to prove my parents had forged the timestamps on their fake legal injunction. Without my hardware, I was completely defenseless against the fabricated federal charges looming over my head. I shoved the military-grade tungsten safe and my laptop into my bag, ignoring Elias as he stood up to ask what was happening. There was no time to explain the critical vulnerability of my network architecture. I sprinted out of the executive suite, bypassed the elevators, and took the emergency stairwell down 42 flights of stairs. I burst through the lobby doors and flagged down a passing cab. The ride back to the Sinclair estate felt like moving through thick molasses. I mentally mapped the layout of the guest house, calculating the exact physical movements required to unrack the server blades, sever the power supply, and load the fragile equipment into a vehicle. My parents had already proven they would cross any legal or moral boundary to maintain their lifestyle. If they realized those unassuming black metallic boxes contained the tools to send them to federal prison, they would smash them to pieces without a second thought. The cab tires finally crunched onto the familiar, pristine gravel of the Sinclair driveway. Before the vehicle even rolled to a complete stop, I shoved the passenger door open and scrambled out onto the pavement. The scene unfolding in front of the guest house was a waking nightmare. The heavy mahogany front doors were propped wide open. A massive white moving truck idled recklessly on the lawn, its heavy tires tearing deep, muddy trenches into the manicured grass. 3 burly men wearing matching gray uniforms were hauling armfuls of my personal belongings out the door and tossing them carelessly toward the truck. My sister Blair stood under the shaded portico directing the absolute chaos. She held a steaming cup of artisan coffee, pointing vaguely with her free hand. Her designer cashmere coat brushed against the doorframe as she supervised the destruction of my life. "Just dump the electronics on the pavement," she commanded, her voice loud and shrill. "She is legally evicted. The interior needs to be completely gutted by noon so the contractors can start measuring for the nursery expansion. Throw it all out." My blood ran cold. One of the movers stepped out onto the porch, holding my primary processing tower. The heavy metal casing housed 4 high-capacity solid-state drives containing every single piece of proprietary forensic software I had built over the last decade. It was the absolute nerve center of my entire defense strategy. The man adjusted his grip casually, swinging his arms back to gain momentum, preparing to toss the heavy metal casing directly onto the unforgiving gravel driveway. I sprinted across the lawn, ignoring the sharp burning sensation in my lungs. "Put that down!" I shouted, my voice cracking with sheer panic. The mover, startled by my sudden screaming, hesitated for a fraction of a second. I did not give him the opportunity to recover his balance. I threw my body directly between him and the driveway, wrapping both of my arms fiercely around the heavy server tower and violently ripping it from his grip. The sharp metallic edges of the cooling fins dug painfully into my chest, and the immense weight dragged me down to my knees, but I held onto the hardware with a death grip. Blair let out an exasperated sigh and stepped down from the porch. "I told you not to make this difficult." "Sydney," she sneered, rolling her eyes. "You were supposed to be gone hours ago. You do not live here anymore, so stop being so dramatic over a stupid computer." "I have a legally binding lease," I fired back slowly, standing up while shielding the server array behind my body. "You cannot execute a self-help eviction without a formal court order and a sheriff present. This is a literal crime, Blair. You are breaking the law." A slow, mocking clap echoed from the stone pathway leading to the main house. Donovan Sinclair strolled casually down the walkway. He had changed out of his aggressive boardroom suit and now wore a relaxed cashmere sweater, looking incredibly comfortable for a man who had just committed multiple federal felonies. He pulled a sleek silver smartphone from his pocket, tapping the screen with practiced arrogance. "You are quoting housing law while standing on my property," Donovan said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "That is highly amusing, Sydney, but you seem to continually forget who actually owns this town." He held the phone to his ear, locking his cold gaze onto mine as the line connected. "Chief Miller," Donovan said, adopting a warm, familiar tone reserved only for his country club peers. "Yes, Donovan here. Listen, Arthur, I need a personal favor. I have an erratic individual refusing to leave my property. She is causing a violent disturbance and actively threatening a hired moving crew. Yes, unfortunately, it is my troubled daughter. I need officers dispatched to the estate immediately to arrest her for criminal trespassing. Donovan lowered his sleek silver smartphone. A sickeningly smug smile spread across his face as he tucked the device back into his cashmere pocket. Chief Miller is sending 2 squad cars, he announced, his voice practically vibrating with arrogant delight. You have about 4 minutes before you leave this property in handcuffs. The largest mover took that as his cue. He cracked his knuckles and lunged forward violently, attempting to rip the primary server tower directly out of my arms. Back off! The command sliced through the damp driveway air with startling authority. Kendrick stepped out from the shadows of the portico, moving with a speed and aggression I had never seen from him before. He shoved his way past Blair and planted his body directly between me and the advancing mover. He pushed the large man hard in the chest, forcing him to stumble backward onto the gravel. Do not touch that hardware, Kendrick growled. As a man who built a highly successful career, engineering corporate data infrastructures, watching brute force applied to enterprise-grade servers was apparently his absolute breaking point. He turned to me, his eyes dropping to the sharp metallic cooling fins currently digging into my ribs. Without asking permission, he gently but firmly took the heavy casing from my grip. Pop your trunk, he muttered. I hit the unlock button on my key fob. My older model sedan was parked just inches from the rear bumper of the idling moving truck. Kendrick carried the server over and carefully slid it into my trunk, wedging it securely against the back wall to prevent it from shifting during transit. He slammed the lid shut and spun around to face the portico. Kendrick, what are you doing? Blair shrieked, her voice echoing off the stone facade of the main house. She stomped down the steps, pointing an accusing finger at my car. She is a trespasser. Put that trash down and let them throw it out. Are you completely out of your mind? Kendrick yelled back. His face flushed with unfiltered disgust. You are supposed to be my wife. You are supposed to pick a side. I am picking a side, Kendrick fired back, stepping toward her. I am picking the side that does not destroy irreplaceable data and extort family members on a driveway. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. Get in your car, Sydney. Drive. I did not waste a single second. I slid behind the wheel, fired up the engine, and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun wildly on the gravel before catching traction. As I sped through the massive iron gates of the Sinclair estate, the high wail of police sirens echoed in the distance, heading rapidly toward my former home. I merged onto the highway and disappeared into the afternoon traffic. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, putting miles of highway between myself and the wealthy enclave of my childhood. I exited the interstate on the edge of the city limits and pulled into the cracked, potholed parking lot of a cheap roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign buzzed erratically, casting harsh pink shadows across the asphalt. It was perfectly anonymous. I paid the front desk clerk in cash, retrieved my equipment from the trunk, and dragged the heavy server tower into room 114. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and harsh industrial bleach. I threw the deadbolt on the flimsy wooden door, shoved a heavy armchair under the handle, and pulled the blackout curtains tightly shut against the failing daylight. I swept a stack of cheap tourist brochures off the laminate desk and hauled the server onto its surface. I bypassed the motel's questionable power strips and plugged my hardware directly into the wall outlet. The familiar, comforting roar of the cooling fans filled the cramped space. I connected my laptop with a heavy-duty data cable and booted up the system. The progress bar for the truth. 1999 file was sitting exactly where the corporate remote kill switch had frozen it at 52%. With my physical server back online and fully disconnected from my employer's compromised network, my proprietary decryption algorithm surged back to life. The numbers climbed rapidly across the screen. 70%? 85%? 99, 100. A satisfying green unlock icon flashed across my monitor. I opened the decrypted archive. It was a massive directory containing hundreds of scanned court records, financial ledgers, and highly confidential hospital reports. I sorted the files chronologically, opening the very first document. It was dated November 1999. I was exactly 2 years old. It was a police collision report. A commercial delivery truck had run a red light at an intersection and broadsided our family sedan. The impact had been catastrophic, specifically on the passenger side where my car seat was strapped. I opened the attached medical file. The black and white text detailed a horrific list of critical injuries: fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, and severe internal bleeding. I had spent 6 agonizing weeks in a pediatric intensive care unit fighting for my life. I clicked the next document. It was a civil court decree. The commercial trucking company corporate insurance division had settled out of court to avoid a highly publicized trial involving a critically injured toddler. The judge had awarded a personal injury settlement of exactly $5 million. The funds were legally mandated to be placed into a protected medical trust solely for my ongoing care, future physical therapy, and lasting damages. My fingers moved rapidly across the trackpad, opening a subfolder labeled Custodial Ledgers. The paper trail Grandma Beatrice had compiled was sickeningly clear. Donovan and Camilla had petitioned the court to act as the sole financial custodians of my medical trust. Once granted access, they systematically dismantled the protective legal structures. They forged signatures, fabricated ongoing medical invoices, and steadily siphoned the funds directly into their private offshore accounts. Beatrice had documented every single stolen dollar. My blood money had not paid for my physical therapy. It had paid for the down payment on the massive Sinclair estate I had just fled. It had funded Camilla exorbitant country club initiation fees. It had propped up Donovan's string of failing, desperate business investments. They drained the entire $5 million in less than 3 years, leaving the trust completely empty. The final document in the folder was a collection agency notice. When I turned 18, I began receiving aggressive phone calls regarding unpaid hospital bills and outstanding surgical debts. My parents had convinced me it was a normal byproduct of the American healthcare system. They told me I had to take on extra jobs to pay off my own childhood medical debt. They watched me work myself to the bone, watched me suffer through severe burnout and anxiety, knowing the entire time they had stolen the $5 million meant to protect me. I sat in the dim light of the motel room, staring at the harsh glow of the laptop screen. The cold, analytical detachment of my forensic training vanished entirely, replaced by a searing, righteous fury. My parents had not just stolen my money. They had stolen my safety, my peace, and the physical agony of a 2-year-old child to buy themselves a luxury lifestyle. They were monsters, and I was going to tear their fraudulent world apart. The physical act of tracing the stolen funds required absolute focus. I partitioned my screen, dedicating the left monitor to the decrypted custodial ledgers and the right to a global banking transaction database. Donovan and Camilla were greedy, but they were not completely financially incompetent. They knew a sudden influx of $5 million into their personal checking accounts would trigger immediate audits by the Internal Revenue Service, so they layered the theft. I isolated the first withdrawal, dated just 3 months after the settlement was awarded. It was for $50,000, routed under the guise of an experimental pediatric physical therapy clinic. I pinged the clinic's tax identification number. It did not exist. The routing number actually belonged to a private wealth management front incorporated in Delaware. Over the next 4 hours, I mapped all 74 withdrawals. My parents had used a web of fictitious medical providers and rehabilitation centers to justify draining the trust. Each withdrawal was funneled into a network of domestic shell companies. I ran a recursive tracking script, forcing my system to follow the digital breadcrumbs left behind by the wire transfers. The Delaware accounts pushed the money to Nevada, then quickly wired the funds to offshore banking havens. I watched my visual mapping software draw bright red lines across a digital globe. The $5 million shattered into hundreds of microtransactions, bouncing rapidly between accounts in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and the Seychelles. It was a sophisticated corporate wash cycle. The constant erratic movement was designed to confuse forensic accountants and bury the original source of the capital forever. But my proprietary algorithm was built precisely to hunt down ghost capital. I initiated a sequence that ignored the sheer volume of transactions and instead tracked the unique cryptographic markers attached to the initial banking authorization codes. The software chewed through the data, reassembling the shattered financial fragments. It took nearly an hour of heavy processing, but the red lines on the map slowly began to converge. By 2012, the stolen money had been thoroughly laundered and consolidated into a single offshore holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Vanguard Solutions. I breached the Cayman corporate registry, bypassing their basic security protocols in seconds. The listed director of Apex Vanguard was a known corporate proxy, a ghost entity used by hundreds of shell companies to shield their owners. But the beneficial ownership documentation, buried deep in the server's backend, revealed the absolute truth. The sole proprietor with ultimate executive control over the account was Donovan Sinclair. I rubbed my tired eyes, the harsh blue light of the monitor burning my retinas. The next step was determining how Donovan had deployed the scrubbed capital. The ledgers showed he had bled nearly $2 million over the years to sustain their lavish lifestyle, covering mortgage payments on the massive estate, luxury vehicles, and Camilla's endless country club expenses. But the remaining $3 million had been moved in a single massive block. I isolated the specific transfer. In 2018, Apex Vanguard wired exactly $3.2 million back into the United States. The destination was a secure escrow account managed by a Silicon Valley venture capital incubator. I ran a targeted query on the escrow routing number. The result flashed across my screen, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The beneficiary of the $3.2 million wire transfer was Sentinel Financial Technologies. I stopped breathing. Sentinel was Kendrick's company. My brother-in-law was a brilliant software architect. He had designed a revolutionary payment processing platform that eventually disrupted the entire commercial banking sector. But Kendrick came from a working-class background in Detroit. He had the genius, but he severely lacked the capital to launch the platform. I remembered the family lore vividly. Donovan had always bragged about recognizing Kendrick's potential, early on stepping in as the primary angel investor to get Sentinel off the ground. It was the reason Blair had met him. It was the reason he was part of the family. My hands flew across the keyboard, pulling the original seed funding agreements from Sentinel's corporate filings. Donovan had structured the investment perfectly. He used the laundered $3.2 million to purchase a 49% controlling stake in the startup. My parents had not just stolen my medical settlement to buy designer clothes. They had used the blood money from my childhood car accident to purchase half of what was now a billion-dollar fintech empire. I needed to know if Kendrick was complicit. If he had known the origin of the capital, he was just as guilty as my parents. I initiated a deep dive into Kendrick's early personal communication logs and the metadata attached to the original funding contracts. I cross-referenced his digital footprint from 2018 against Donovan's offshore accounts. The data exonerated him completely. Kendrick's internal emails to his early development team expressed profound gratitude for Donovan's legitimate venture capital. The financial disclosures showed Kendrick had run standard background checks on the funding, but Donovan had used a pristine secondary investment firm to front the Apex Vanguard money. Kendrick was entirely blind to the offshore wash cycle. He genuinely believed his wealthy future father-in-law was simply providing clean seed capital to support a promising tech startup. Kendrick had absolutely no idea that his entire life's work, his billion-dollar company, and his professional legacy were built entirely on the stolen funds of a crippled 2-year-old girl. The revelation completely altered the battlefield. Donovan did not just hold leverage over me. He held the financial sword of Damocles over Kendrick's head. If the federal authorities discovered Sentinel was founded on laundered stolen capital, the Securities and Exchange Commission would freeze the company's assets instantly. Kendrick's life would be destroyed alongside mine. I reached into my bag and pulled out the prepaid burner phone I had purchased with cash at a gas station earlier that evening. I needed a secure, untraceable line of communication. I pressed the power button, waiting for the cheap device to connect to the local cell towers. The moment the network registered, the screen illuminated with a harsh chime. A single unread text message was waiting. It was from a scrambled proxy number, but the encryption protocol matched the custom secure channel Kendrick and I had set up years ago for sharing sensitive server data. I opened the message. The text was urgent and terrifyingly precise. Meet me at the coffee shop on 4th Street. Your parents are planning something illegal to force my company into an IPO, and I need your help. I shoved the burner phone into my jacket pocket and packed the decrypted laptop back into my secure satchel. Leaving the motel room heavily locked, I navigated the damp night air toward my car. 4th Street was on the industrial edge of the city. The coffee shop Kendrick had chosen was a glowing 24-hour diner, catering to night shift warehouse workers and long-haul truckers. It was entirely outside the Sinclair family radius. I parked in the shadows near a flickering street lamp and walked inside. The harsh fluorescent lighting reflected off the faded linoleum. Kendrick was sitting in a back corner booth, staring vacantly into a mug of black coffee. He looked nothing like the polished tech billionaire who usually graced the covers of financial magazines. His tie was gone, his collar was unbuttoned, and the heavy exhaustion in his posture made him look a decade older. I slid into the vinyl booth opposite him, placing my heavy satchel on the table between us. You took a massive risk texting a secure channel on an unverified network, I stated, keeping my voice low. Kendrick looked up, his eyes bloodshot. I had no choice, Sydney. The corporate network is compromised and I cannot trust my own executive team. Donovan is executing a hostile takeover of Sentinel. I leaned forward, keeping my hands flat on the table. Explain the mechanics. He took a slow breath, resting his forearms on the sticky laminate. Your father has spent the last 14 months quietly weaponizing his board seats. I thought he was just an aggressive angel investor protecting his early stake. But he has been buying up proxy votes through anonymous holding companies. He essentially controls 51% of the voting power now. On Friday, he is forcing an emergency board vote to trigger a premature initial public offering. An early IPO dilutes your founder shares, I said, immediately seeing the financial architecture of the trap. Exactly, Kendrick replied, his voice tightening with barely contained fury. The restructuring terms embedded in the IPO filing include a hostile leadership clause. The moment Sentinel goes public, Donovan will possess the voting majority to instantly oust me from my own company. He is going to install his own puppet CEO and seize total control of a billion-dollar platform I built from scratch. He is stealing my life's work, Sydney. I need your forensic expertise to comb the board communications and find the proxy violations before Friday. I stared at the man across from me. He genuinely believed his biggest problem was corporate espionage. He had no idea he was already standing at the bottom of a financial crater. I unzipped my satchel and pulled out my laptop. I booted the machine and opened the Decrypted Truth 1999 directory. I did not offer any comforting words. I simply turned the screen around so it faced him directly. Donovan Sinclair is not stealing your company, Kendrick. I said, my tone perfectly flat. He already owns it. He bought it with my blood. Kendrick frowned, staring at the screen. What is this? That is the unredacted financial routing history of Apex Vanguard Solutions, I explained, tapping the trackpad to highlight the specific transaction lines. Apex Vanguard is a Cayman Islands shell company solely controlled by Donovan. In 2018, that exact entity wired $3.2 million into your Silicon Valley incubator. Kendrick flinched. That was the seed money. Donovan brokered that through a legitimate stateside firm. The stateside firm was a blind proxy, I stated, bringing up the next document. I pulled up the civil court decree from 1999. The $3.2 million was the remainder of a $5 million medical settlement awarded to me after a catastrophic car accident. My parents forged the custodial documents and embezzled the entire trust. They laundered the capital offshore, and then Donovan used it to purchase his 49% controlling stake in Sentinel. Your entire company, the platform you built, The algorithms you coded it is all entirely funded by stolen money meant to cover the medical care of a severely injured toddler. I watched the color drain completely from Kendrick's face. The harsh diner lights illuminated the profound, sickening realization washing over his features. He was a man who prided himself on his integrity. He had built his reputation on the myth of the self-made Detroit programmer who conquered Silicon Valley with clean code and hard work. Now he was looking at undeniable forensic proof that his empire, his immense wealth, and even his marriage to my sister were inextricably tied to a grotesque financial crime. He physically recoiled from the laptop, pressing his back against the vinyl booth. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. He rubbed his hands over his face as if trying to physically wipe away the information. "My God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He bought me. He bought the company using your pain. And Blair. Blair is a Sinclair," I reminded him coldly. "She will protect her lifestyle over your integrity every single time. If the Securities and Exchange Commission discovers Sentinel is capitalized with laundered funds, they will freeze all assets. You will be indicted as a co-conspirator simply because your signature is on the founding documents. Donovan holds a loaded gun to your head and you did not even know it was there." Kendrick stared at the cold coffee in his mug for a long time. The ambient noise of the diner faded into the background. When he finally looked back up at me, the shock had vanished entirely. It was replaced by a cold, calculating rage. The tech visionary had returned, but now he had a clear target. "We have 72 hours until the board vote," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If I expose the origin of the seed money now, Sentinel collapses and thousands of my employees lose their livelihoods. But if Donovan takes control, he will strip the company for parts anyway. I need a third option. I need to amputate him from the corporate structure completely." I closed my laptop and rested my hands on the metallic casing. I can trigger an automated federal freeze on Donovan's specific proxy shares without exposing the core foundation of Sentinel. If his shares are frozen pending a targeted embezzlement investigation, his voting power is nullified. The IPO vote fails, and you retain executive control. But I cannot do that from the outside. I need a direct, untraceable access point to trace the rest of his internal embezzlement. Kendrick did not hesitate. He grabbed a paper napkin from the dispenser and pulled a pen from his jacket. He quickly scribbled an IP address, an administrative username, and a complex string of alphanumeric characters. He slid the napkin across the sticky table. "That is the root access master key to Sentinel's internal financial servers," Kendrick stated, sliding his coffee mug aside. "It bypasses all employee monitoring protocols and corporate firewalls. You will have God-level clearance to every ledger account and executive communication log in the company. Find every single illegal maneuver Donovan made using my platform. Map it, document it, and weaponize it." I took the napkin and folded it neatly, slipping it into my pocket. "In exchange," I asked, knowing the parameters of a tactical alliance. "In exchange," Kendrick said, leaning forward, his eyes burning with absolute determination, "you burn Donovan Sinclair to the ground, and you help me secure my company. We dismantle him together." I nodded, securing the folded napkin in my pocket. "We dismantle him together." 48 hours later, the architecture of our retaliation was fully weaponized. Kendrick's root access key had functioned flawlessly. Operating from a secured remote node, I ripped through Sentinel's back-end financial infrastructure with God-level clearance. Donovan was incredibly sloppy in his arrogance. He had utilized his board proxy status to funnel corporate capital through the exact same Cayman Island networks he used to launder my settlement money. He was aggressively inflating Sentinel's pre-IPO valuation by looping phantom revenue through his own offshore shell companies. It was textbook securities fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement. I captured every single cryptographic signature, every hidden routing number, and every falsified ledger entry. The climax of Donovan's fraudulent campaign was happening tonight. The Sinclair family was hosting a hyper-exclusive black tie gala at the Sovereign Grand Hotel. It was an investor showcase, a lavish spectacle designed to dazzle the heavy-hitting institutional financiers right before Friday's hostile board vote. I stepped out of a hired town car and onto the pristine red carpet. I was not wearing my usual oversized hoodie and dark jeans. I wore a tailored floor-length midnight blue evening gown that hugged my frame. My hair was swept up in a severe architectural twist, and my makeup was understated but flawless. I carried a sleek leather clutch containing a single high-processing iPad. I looked exactly like the generational wealth I was pretending to represent. Two private security contractors flanked the heavy gilded doors of the ballroom holding digital scanners. I did not hesitate. I walked directly up to the perimeter and held out my smartphone. Kendrick had generated a phantom VIP credential bypassing the strict guest list entirely. The scanner chimed a pleasant green tone. The guard stepped aside, offering a polite nod, and held the heavy door open for me. I slipped quietly inside the belly of the beast. The grand ballroom was a monument to stolen opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting refracted light over dozens of tables draped in heavy white silk. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and caviar. The room buzzed with the low hum of predatory wealth, the clinking of crystal, and the scent of expensive perfume. A hush fell over the room as the live string quartet faded out. A brilliant white spotlight illuminated the main stage. Camilla stepped up to the microphone wearing a custom diamond-studded gown, paid for by my shattered ribs. She looked out over the crowd of investors, pressing her hand to her chest in a grotesque display of manufactured humility. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Camilla purred, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. When my husband Donovan and I first recognized the potential of Sentinel Technologies, we knew we were investing in more than just software. We were investing in family. I stood near a towering floral arrangement, keeping my face in the shadows. The sheer hypocrisy of her words was nauseating. In this ruthless corporate world, Camilla continued, wiping a perfectly choreographed tear from her eye, we pride ourselves on ethical business. We believe in building from the ground up with integrity, transparency, and above all, unwavering loyalty to the people who matter most. We are inviting you to join, not just an IPO, but our family legacy. Applause rippled through the room. While my parents basked in the unearned adulation, I turned my attention to the seating chart Kendrick had mapped out for me. Table 1 sat directly in the center of the room, prime real estate just below the stage. It was occupied by 4 men and 2 women. These were not low-level venture capitalists. These were the apex predators of the global financial sector, the directors of multinational pension funds and managing partners of sovereign wealth conglomerates. They represented the billions of dollars Donovan absolutely needed to successfully launch the IPO and execute his hostile takeover. I moved smoothly through the perimeter of the room, keeping my posture relaxed and my head high. I did not cause a scene. I did not march onto the stage to confront my mother. Emotional outbursts were for amateurs. I was here to perform a surgical strike on their capital. I reached table 1 just as the waiters began pouring the first-course wine. The investors were murmuring amongst themselves, calculating risk and reward based on Camilla's speech. I stepped up behind the chairman of the largest investment firm present. "Good evening," I said, my voice pitched low and entirely devoid of emotion. "I apologize for the interruption, but I represent an independent risk assessment entity. I highly recommend you view this before committing a single dollar of capital to Sentinel Technologies." I pulled the iPad from my clutch and placed it squarely on the center of the table, right over the expensive floral centerpiece. The screen was already unlocked, displaying a streamlined hyper-visual dashboard I had coded specifically for this exact moment. "What is this?" the chairman asked, frowning at the device. I tapped the screen. "That is the complete forensic trail of Donovan Sinclair's pre-IPO tax evasion and corporate embezzlement," I stated calmly. The other 5 investors stopped talking instantly. They leaned in, their eyes locking onto the glowing screen. I swiped right, pulling up the Cayman Island Shell Company registries. "You are currently looking at Apex Vanguard Solutions," I explained, pointing to the bright red lines connecting Sentinel's corporate accounts to the offshore entity. "Donovan Sinclair is using this proxy to loop phantom revenue back into Sentinel." He is artificially inflating the company's valuation to secure your institutional funding. Furthermore, the initial seed capital used to purchase his controlling stake was illegally laundered through the same network. The chairman reached for his reading glasses, his face rapidly draining of color. Are you claiming the founding capital is compromised? I am proving it, I replied, tapping the screen again to reveal the SEC tip line confirmation code I had generated but not yet submitted. I have the cryptographic signatures, the routing numbers, and the proxy ownership documents. The federal authorities will be initiating a massive asset freeze and a full criminal audit before the end of the fiscal quarter. One of the female investors, a sharp-eyed woman managing a massive tech portfolio, looked up at me, her expression tight with alarm. If the SEC freezes Sentinel assets during the IPO window, our entire capital commitment gets locked in federal litigation for years. Exactly, I said, maintaining direct eye contact with her. Donovan Sinclair is using your institutional wealth as a shield against his own criminal liability. If you proceed with Friday's board vote, you are not buying equity in a tech company. You are buying a federal indictment. I tapped the iPad one final time, sending the entire unredacted dossier of evidence directly to their secure corporate email addresses using the contact list Kendrick had provided. I picked up my device and slipped it gracefully back into my clutch. I strongly advise you to pull your funding and decline the board vote before the Securities and Exchange Commission makes this information public. I said, my tone perfectly cordial. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I turned and walked away from table 1, leaving the most powerful investors in the room staring at their phones in absolute horrified silence. The financial panic was already setting in. I could hear furious whispers and the scraping of chairs against the marble floor as they prepared to quietly exit the ballroom and initiate their emergency divestment protocols. On stage, Camilla was still smiling, waving to the crowd, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just quietly severed the financial jugular of their entire fraudulent empire. I slipped out the heavy side doors of the ballroom and vanished into the night. I stepped out the heavy side doors of the ballroom, fully intending to vanish into the night. But my escape was abruptly cut short. The humid evening air had barely touched my face when a shrill, frantic voice sliced through the elegant ambiance of the gala, carrying perfectly over the live string quartet. Sydney. I paused on the marble threshold and turned back toward the brilliantly lit room. Blair was stomping aggressively across the polished floor. Her custom silk gown flared around her legs as she moved with aggressive, frantic energy. She had clearly been monitoring the VIP section from afar. She had watched the most crucial institutional investors at Table 1 abruptly stand up, their faces drained of color, as they hastily gathered their coats to flee the premises. It did not take long for her to trace the epicenter of their sudden financial panic directly back to my retreating figure. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The polished, poised facade of the perfect tech CEO wife had evaporated entirely. She closed the distance between us in seconds. In her right hand, she gripped a large crystal goblet filled to the brim with an expensive vintage Bordeaux. She did not pause to ask questions. She did not demand an explanation. She simply lunged forward and hurled the dark red liquid directly at my chest. The wine splashed violently against my tailored midnight blue evening gown. The cold liquid soaked instantly through the expensive fabric, running in dark, sticky rivulets down my neck and pooling uncomfortably against my skin. The crystal goblet slipped from her fingers and shattered loudly on the marble floor, sending sharp, glittering shards scattering across our shoes. "What did you say to them, you insane dropout?" Blair shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and drawing the horrified stares of every wealthy socialite in our immediate vicinity. "You are nothing. You are a failure. Security. Get security over here right now and remove this trash from my event." The sudden chaotic disruption drew the immediate attention of the entire ballroom. The live string quartet faltered and ground to a screeching halt. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the opulent space. From the far side of the room near the grand stage, Donovan noticed the commotion. He descended the carpeted stairs with rapid, heavy steps. He took one look at the fleeing billionaires abandoning Table 1 and then locked his furious gaze squarely on me. He instantly understood that I had poisoned his investor pool. But Donovan Sinclair never panicked in public. He operated on a foundation of absolute control and predatory arrogance. Instead of shouting, he simply raised his right hand and made a sharp, sweeping motion. The response was instantaneous. 3 large men detached themselves from the shadows of the ballroom perimeter and moved toward me with alarming speed. These were not standard event bouncers or hotel security personnel. They were wearing dark tailored suits, but their posture and tactical spacing gave them away immediately. They were off-duty officers from Chief Miller's precinct. They were the exact same corrupt local police contacts Donovan kept firmly secured on his personal payroll, functioning as his private muscle. The largest of the 3 men reached me first. He did not ask me to step outside. He did not read me my rights. He simply grabbed my upper arm with a bruising vice-like grip and wrenched my hands forcefully behind my back. The sudden violence of the movement sent a sharp spike of pain radiating through my shoulders. "Hold her right there," the officer barked, pressing his heavy forearm aggressively against my spine to pin me in place. Donovan finally reached the doorway, stepping carefully over the shattered crystal of Blair's wine glass. A sickeningly smug smile spread across his face as he surveyed my soaked dress and pinned arms. He adjusted his silk tie, completely unbothered by the hundreds of wealthy guests watching the spectacle unfold. "You really thought you could walk into my event and sabotage my company?" Donovan sneered, leaning in close so only I could hear the venom in his voice. "You breached secure corporate networks. You bypassed digital security protocols. That is textbook corporate espionage, Sydney. It is a federal cybercrime. You are going to spend the next 20 years rotting in a concrete cell, and I am going to personally ensure the judge throws away the key." He nodded to the officer holding me. "Cuff her. Get her out of my sight." I did not struggle. I did not waste my breath trying to reason with a man who had stolen my medical settlement to buy his own wealth. I kept my breathing steady and my posture completely rigid as the officer pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The cold metal bit sharply into my skin. The ratcheting gear snapped tight, clicking securely around my left wrist. The officer wrenched my right arm back, preparing to lock the second cuff in place. Donovan let out a low, satisfied chuckle, turning away to begin doing damage control with his remaining panicked investors. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed he had finally neutralized the only threat to his fraudulent empire. Then the entire building shook. A deafening booming crash echoed from the main entrance of the Sovereign Grand Hotel. The massive double oak doors of the Grand Ballroom did not just open. They were violently kicked inward, shattering the heavy brass locking mechanisms and sending splinters flying across the reception foyer. The wealthy guests screamed, falling backward and scrambling over each other in sheer terror. The corrupt local cops froze their hands, hovering over their weapons. A highly coordinated team of federal agents swarmed into the opulent space. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision. They were completely clad in dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, and combat boots. Bright bold yellow letters spelling out FBI and SEC Task Force were emblazoned across their tactical armor. They fanned out across the room, instantly securing every exit and locking down the perimeter in a matter of seconds. Donovan stopped dead in his tracks. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute uncomprehending horror. Blair let out a terrified gasp, taking a stumbling step backward. A tall, broad-shouldered federal agent wearing a heavy tactical vest and a severe expression marched straight through the parted sea of terrified billionaires. He completely ignored the frantic questions of the gala attendees. He walked with total unwavering authority directly toward the side doors where the corrupt local officer was currently attempting to lock the second handcuff around my wrist. The lead agent did not ask for permission. He stopped inches away from the corrupt cop, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. His voice boomed across the dead-silent ballroom, carrying absolute devastating finality. "Release her. We have a federal warrant to seize the Sinclair family's assets for mass wire fraud and tax evasion." The corrupt officer's grip went slack. The heavy steel cuff dangling from my left wrist clattered loudly against the polished marble floor. He stepped away from me instantly, raising his hands in a gesture of complete submission. The lead federal agent did not even look at him twice. He gestured sharply to two heavily armed operatives behind him. They moved past me in a blur of dark tactical gear, marching directly toward Donovan Sinclair. The grand ballroom devolved into absolute pandemonium. The apex predators of the financial world, the billionaires who had been sipping vintage champagne seconds earlier, were now scrambling frantically toward the exits. But there was no escape. Federal agents flanked every set of double doors, tying the heavy brass handles and ordering the elite guests to remain exactly where they were. Donovan stood rooted to the spot near the edge of the stage, his tailored tuxedo suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, attempting to deploy the smooth, charismatic charm that had built his fraudulent empire. "There has been a monumental misunderstanding," Donovan said, his voice projecting across the silent, terrified room. "I am the acting chairman of Sentinel Technologies. I have the chief of police on speed dial. Whoever authorized this rogue operation is going to be looking for employment by tomorrow morning." The lead agent pulled a thick stack of heavily redacted legal documents from his tactical vest. He stepped onto the bottom stair of the stage, staring Donovan down with clinical detachment. "Nobody authorized a spontaneous raid, Mr. Sinclair," the agent stated, his voice echoing clearly. "You authorized it yourself. You signed your own warrant the moment you filed a hostile emergency injunction against Beatrice Sinclair's estate." I stood near the floral arrangement, rubbing my bruised wrist as the pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. Grandma Beatrice was not just a wealthy matriarch. She was a tactical genius who had played a breathtaking game of financial chess entirely from the grave. Donovan's face contorted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I filed a standard asset freeze on a contested $25 million family trust. It was a private civil motion." "It was a bear trap," the agent corrected, sliding the top document forward. Beatrice Sinclair legally embedded an automated poison pill deep within the bylaws of her primary trust. The clause was irrevocable. It dictated that any hostile attempt by you or your wife to freeze or contest the capital would instantaneously trigger an automatic, unfiltered audit by the Internal Revenue Service. You invited the federal government directly into your own financial architecture. I could see the exact moment Donovan realized the magnitude of his fatal error. His knees buckled slightly. He reached out to grip the edge of the stage to keep himself from collapsing. Grandma Beatrice had known her son was ruled entirely by his own insatiable greed. She knew he would never let $25 million slip through his fingers. She banked on him trying to steal it. And by trying to steal her money, he had legally handed the federal government the master keys to his entire corrupt kingdom. But an IRS audit alone would have taken years to untangle Donovan's offshore shell companies. He had scrubbed the accounts, layered the proxy servers, and buried the money in the Cayman Islands. The federal authorities would have hit a massive firewall of international banking privacy laws. That is where my data came in. The lead agent turned his head and locked eyes with me, giving a sharp, respectful nod. "We received an anonymous encrypted data dump to the Securities and Exchange Commission tip line exactly 48 hours ago. The file contained an unredacted forensic map of Apex Vanguard Solutions. It gave us the cryptographic keys, the exact server IP addresses, and the proxy ownership documents." The agent looked back at Donovan, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh stage lighting. "The IRS audit you triggered matched your current domestic asset portfolio directly to a stolen $5 million medical settlement from 1999. The anonymous forensic map simply gave my cyber division the exact coordinates to prove you laundered the capital." Donovan turned slowly, looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You set me up. You orchestrated this entire thing." "I did not set you up, Donovan," I said, stepping forward, my voice cutting through the silent ballroom. "Your own mother set you up. I just provided the ammunition. If you had let me walk away with my rightful inheritance, you might have survived. But you could not resist trying to steal from me one last time. Your greed is the exact mechanism that destroyed you." Camilla let out a piercing, theatrical wail from the center of the stage. She dropped to her knees, the custom diamond-studded gown pooling around her on the floor. She covered her face, sobbing wildly and begging the agents to realize she was just an innocent wife who knew nothing about corporate finance. Blair was paralyzed. She stood near the shattered remains of her crystal wine goblet, staring at the federal agents swarming the venue. Two forensic accountants wearing SEC windbreakers were already confiscating the laptops and smartphones from Donovan's executive team at the VIP tables. They were bagging the devices in anti-static evidence pouches, locking down the digital footprint of the hostile takeover before Donovan could initiate a remote wipe. Kendrick stepped out from the shadows near the catering entrance. He walked past the detained executives and the panicked billionaires. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his ruined father-in-law. He walked straight up to the lead federal agent and handed over a heavy encrypted hard drive. "This contains the internal communication logs for Sentinel Technologies," Kendrick said, his voice steady and absolute. "It proves Donovan Sinclair acted alone, utilizing his board proxy status to embezzle capital without executive authorization. I am granting you full unrestricted access to the corporate servers." The lead agent took the drive, sealing it carefully in an evidence bag. "Thank you for your cooperation." Donovan lunged forward, his composure shattering completely. "You traitor!" he screamed at Kendrick, spit flying from his lips. "I built you. I funded your miserable little startup. You are nothing without my capital." The lead agent did not even blink. He grabbed Donovan by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, spinning him around and slamming him hard against the stage railing. The agent kicked Donovan's legs apart and violently wrenched his arms behind his back, pulling out a pair of heavy tactical zip ties. "Donovan Sinclair, you are under arrest for mass wire fraud, tax evasion, corporate embezzlement, and the grand theft of a protected medical trust," the agent recited, locking the thick plastic restraints tightly around Donovan's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." I stood in the center of the ballroom, watching the architects of my childhood misery being dismantled piece by piece. The flashing red and blue lights of dozens of federal vehicles pulsed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the absolute ruin of the Sinclair family legacy. Grandma Beatrice had laid the trap perfectly. I had supplied the tactical firepower, and Donovan's own relentless greed had pulled the trigger. The lead federal agent grabbed Donovan by the arm and hauled him off the main stage. The grand ballroom had descended into total chaos, but the tactical team moved with practiced efficiency. They corralled the core members of the Sinclair family directly into a soundproofed, glass-walled VIP lounge adjacent to the main floor. It was a sleek, geometric space designed for private, high-level corporate negotiations. Now it was a holding pen. Kendrick followed them inside voluntarily, his face an unreadable mask. The lead agent caught my eye and tipped his head, granting me silent permission to follow. I stepped over the threshold just as the heavy glass doors clicked shut, isolating us from the sirens and the shouting outside. Through the transparent walls, we could see the tactical task force systematically tearing apart the gala. Inside the VIP room, the silence was heavy and suffocating. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone. For a brief second, nobody moved. The Sinclairs were completely paralyzed by the sudden violent evaporation of their reality. Then the illusion of the perfect family violently fractured. Camilla was the first to break. She did not rush to comfort her restrained husband. She did not express outrage at the federal agents standing guard outside the glass. Instead, she turned her furious wide eyes directly onto Donovan. The polished, poised matriarch of the Sinclair dynasty melted away, leaving behind a cornered, predatory animal. She paced the perimeter of the leather couches, her diamond-studded gown rustling sharply with every frantic step. "You absolute incompetent fool!" Camilla shrieked, her voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at Donovan, who was slumped in a modern armchair with his hands zip-tied behind his back. "You promised me this financial structure was bulletproof. You looked me in the eye and swore the Cayman proxies were buried so deep the federal government would never find them." Donovan glared up at her, His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. Keep your mouth shut, Camilla. Every word you say right now is going to be used against us in federal court. Used against us, Camilla repeated, letting out a piercing, humorless laugh. There is no us anymore, Donovan. You dragged me into this mess. You handled the accounting. You managed the offshore routing. I was just the wife. I am not going to federal prison because you were too arrogant to cover your own digital tracks. You sloppy, pathetic excuse for a businessman. You have ruined my life. You have destroyed my social standing. You enjoyed every single second of that stolen wealth, Donovan roared back, struggling uselessly against the thick plastic restraints binding his wrists. Do not stand there and play the innocent victim, Camilla. You demanded the private jets. You demanded the sovereign grand galas. You spent the medical settlement money just as fast as I could launder it. You are just as guilty as I am, and you are going to burn right beside me. They tore into each other with vicious, terrifying speed. Decades of manufactured public affection dissolved into a venomous, screaming match. They hurled insults, accusations, and threats, tearing away the remaining shreds of their dignity. It was a toxic implosion. The glass room acted like a terrarium, allowing me to stand in the corner and safely observe the parasites consuming themselves. Blair stood completely frozen near the center of the room. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her thick layer of entitlement. She looked through the glass walls, watching federal agents physically confiscate her mother's luxury vehicles from the valet line outside. She realized her platinum credit cards were already dead plastic. Her trust fund was frozen. Her mansions would be seized. Her entire identity, which was built entirely on predatory wealth, was evaporating into thin air. A low whimpering sound escaped her throat. The fierce, aggressive woman who had hurled a glass of wine at my chest just minutes ago was completely gone. She was regressing into a terrified, helpless child. She turned away from her screaming parents and locked her desperate, tear-filled eyes onto Kendrick. He was standing near the exit, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored trousers. He looked entirely untouched by the hysteria infecting the room. Blair rushed toward him, her expensive silk heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She practically threw herself at his chest, grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo jacket with trembling, white-knuckled fingers. "Kendrick," she sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully. "Kendrick, you have to fix this. You have to do something. You are the CEO. You are a tech billionaire. Call your lawyers. Call the board of directors. Buy us out of this. Pay the federal fines. Just make them let us go. I cannot lose everything, Kendrick. I cannot be poor. Please, you have to save me." She buried her face in his chest, weeping openly, leaving streaks of expensive mascara on his crisp white shirt. She clung to him as if he were a life raft in a churning ocean, expecting him to do what he had always done. She expected him to absorb the damage, pay the bills, and shield her from the consequences of her own actions. Kendrick did not wrap his arms around her. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He stood perfectly rigid, allowing her to cry against him for 5 long seconds. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, he raised his hands. He grabbed her wrists and gently, but with absolute unyielding force, pried her fingers off his jacket. He took a single deliberate step backward, physically severing the connection between them. Blair stumbled, looking up at him with profound confusion. "I am not your safety net," Blair Kendrick said. His voice was not angry. It was not bitter. It was completely surgically devoid of any emotion whatsoever. That coldness was far more devastating than any screaming match. "You do not understand," she pleaded, reaching out for him again. "They are going to take the house. They are going to take everything. They are going to take everything your father stole." Kendrick corrected, his tone flat and unyielding. "And I am not going to spend a single dime of my clean capital to defend a family of parasites. You thought I was just a walking checkbook. You thought you could use my company as a shield for your father's corporate espionage. You were wrong." Blair's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at him as if he were a stranger. "I handed the federal agents full administrative control of my personal servers 20 minutes ago." Kendrick continued, staring down at her with hollow eyes. I isolated my uncorrupted founder shares and secured them in a protected federal escrow account. The Securities and Exchange Commission has granted me total immunity for my cooperation. I am walking out of this building with my company, my freedom, and my capital completely intact. He paused, adjusting his cuffs with careful, meticulous movements. And as of yesterday morning, I have officially filed for divorce. Kendrick stated, the finality of his words echoing off the glass walls. My legal team has already served the papers to your father's estate attorneys. There will be no settlement. There will be no alimony. You get absolutely nothing. No. Blair screamed, a guttural, agonizing sound tearing from her throat. No, Kendrick, please, you cannot do this to me. Kendrick did not look at her again. He turned his back on his weeping wife, his screaming mother-in-law, and his restrained father-in-law. He walked straight toward the heavy glass doors. The federal agent standing guard immediately stepped aside, holding the door open to allow him to pass. He stepped out into the chaotic ballroom and vanished into the crowd, leaving the Sinclair family entirely behind. Blair's legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, her designer gown bunching up around her knees. She curled her arms around her stomach, sobbing violently into the polished wood. Her parents ignored her, continuing to scream vicious accusations at one another across the room. I stood quietly in the corner, the spilled wine drying on my dress, watching the absolute permanent destruction of the Sinclair dynasty. Donovan's head snapped up. He had stopped shouting at Camilla, his chest heaving, as the reality of the heavy plastic zip ties digging into his wrists finally registered. His eyes darted around the glass-walled VIP room, moving past the impassive federal agent standing guard outside, before finally landing on me. The raw, predatory rage that had fueled him for decades suddenly extinguished, replaced by a sickening, desperate panic. He shuffled awkwardly toward me, restricted by the cuffs, his polished shoes scuffing against the hardwood. Camilla was quick to follow. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged tracks, ruining her pristine makeup. The absolute terror of losing her status, her wealth, and her freedom stripped away every ounce of her sophisticated veneer. They were no longer titans of industry. They were cornered rats. Sydney. Donovan rasped, his voice dropping to a frantic, gravelly whisper. He glanced nervously at the agents beyond the glass, terrified they were recording audio. Sydney, listen to me. We can fix this. You can fix this. You are the only one who understands the back-end architecture. You have the access codes. You can tell them it was a misunderstanding. I did not blink. I did not move. I just watched him sweat. Tell them it was a family loan, Camilla blurted out, stepping in front of her husband. She reached out, her trembling fingers hovering just inches from my arm, afraid to actually touch the wine-stained fabric of my dress. Please, Sydney. You have to tell the federal investigators that the 1999 settlement was a family loan, a verbal agreement, an undocumented familial investment to launch Sentinel Technologies. If you testify that we had your permission, the wire fraud charges collapse. The embezzlement charges disappear. We are your parents, Donovan added, attempting to force a look of paternal warmth onto his panicked features. It was a grotesque, unnatural expression. We gave you life. We raised you. We just borrowed the capital to build a legacy for all of us, for the family. You cannot let them put us in a federal penitentiary over a simple accounting error. We will pay you back. With interest, we will give you equity in Sentinel, whatever you want. They were incredible. Even now, facing absolute ruin surrounded by federal agents, their instinct was to lie, manipulate, and leverage the very concept of family they had spent my entire life destroying. They genuinely believed that I was as weak and easily bought as the rest of their inner circle. They thought a few hollow promises and a fake plea for familial loyalty would erase decades of neglect and theft. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt only a profound, icy clarity. I slowly unclasped the sleek leather clutch I held in my hands. I bypassed the high-processing iPad I had used to dismantle their investors and reached into the hidden inner pocket. My fingers brushed against thick, aged paper. I pulled out a folded, heavily worn manila folder. It was the original physical copy of my 1999 medical file, the exact document detailing the catastrophic injuries I had suffered as a toddler and the subsequent $5 million insurance payout meant for my lifelong care. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Donovan and Camilla held their breath, their eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope. They actually thought I was going to agree to their fabricated story. I raised my hand and dropped the yellowed medical file onto the center of the polished mahogany negotiation table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. I looked directly into Donovan's bloodshot eyes and then shifted my gaze to Camilla's tear-stained face. I did not yell. I did not cry. My voice was dead calm, carrying the precise razor-sharp edge of a blade. "You spent my blood money to build a fake empire," I stated, letting the words hang in the chilled air of the VIP room. "Now watch it burn." I did not wait for their response. I turned on my heel, the hem of my ruined dress sweeping across the floor, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, the heavy glass doors hissed open. The lead federal agent stepped into the room, flanked by two armed operatives. "Donovan Sinclair." "Camilla Sinclair." The agent's voice boomed, drowning out Camilla's sudden, hysterical scream. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." I walked straight out of the VIP lounge and re-entered the grand ballroom. The space was a disaster zone. The remaining elite guests were being corralled by SEC officials, their identities being recorded before they were permitted to leave. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but the atmosphere of untouchable wealth had been entirely shattered. I moved through the wreckage with steady, purposeful steps. No one tried to stop me. The federal agents recognized my face from the encrypted data drop and silently stepped aside, clearing a path for my exit. I pushed through the heavy front doors of the Sovereign Grand Hotel and stepped out into the damp, cool night air. The contrast was staggering. Behind me, the lobby was a chaotic blur of flashing red and blue police lights, shouting officers and panicked billionaires. Out here, the city streets were quiet, bathed in the soft, flickering amber glow of the street lamps. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the crisp air. It was over. The Sinclair dynasty was dead. Then my smartphone vibrated sharply inside my clutch. The sudden buzzing shattered the momentary peace. I pulled the device out and glanced at the encrypted screen. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen in weeks. Elias Thorne, Grandma Beatrice's notoriously ruthless estate lawyer and the sole executor of her final will. I swiped the screen to accept the call and lifted the phone to my ear. "Thorne. The raid was successful. Donovan is currently being read his Miranda rights." "I know," Sidney Thorne replied. His voice was crisp, urgent, and entirely devoid of celebration. There was a sharp metallic tension in his tone that instantly put me on high alert. "I have been monitoring the federal wire. The SEC officially unfroze the core assets of the estate the second Donovan was detained. But we have a massive problem." I frowned, stepping further into the shadows of the hotel courtyard. "Explain the mechanics." "The poison pill worked perfectly. The audit was triggered." "The poison pill worked exactly as Beatrice intended," Thorne said, speaking with rapid, clipped precision. "But the feds unfreezing the trust triggered a secondary protocol deep within the estate's black box servers. Beatrice did not just set a trap for Donovan. She set a final test for you." My grip tightened on the phone. "A test? What kind of test?" "Grandma B put a final biological lock on the $25 million, Thorne explained, the sound of furious typing echoing in the background of the call. "The capital is sitting in a dormant holding account, completely insulated from the federal seizure. But it requires a biometric cryptographic key to release the funds to your personal routing numbers. It is a dual authentication sequence that only you can authorize." I stared out at the dark city skyline, my mind racing through the digital architecture of the trust. "Where is the physical terminal?" "That is the cliff edge we are currently standing on," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a grim warning. "The terminal is located inside the old Sinclair manufacturing vault downtown. The server is counting down. If you do not execute the final code by midnight, the failsafe engages. The entire $25 million automatically defaults to a charity. "You have exactly 2 hours, Sydney. Get moving." I ended the call and broke into a sprint. I kicked off the expensive silk heels, leaving them abandoned on the wet pavement, and ran barefooted through the damp night air. Elias Thorne's private legal firm was located 4 blocks from the hotel, deeply embedded in the financial district. I gripped the heavy fabric of my midnight blue gown and ripped a sharp tear up the thigh, freeing my legs for maximum mobility. The freezing asphalt bit into my soles, but the adrenaline masked the pain. I navigated the shadowed alleyways with singular focus. The biometric locks at the entrance of Thorne's building flashed green before my hand even touched the glass. Elias was waiting in the dimly lit lobby, bypassing all standard security protocols. He looked stark and severe, wearing a heavy trench coat over a hastily buttoned dress shirt. Without wasting a single breath on greetings, he turned and marched toward his private corner office. I followed, my lungs burning, leaving wet footprints on the polished marble floor. Inside, the office smelled of aged paper and leather. Thorne bypassed his massive mahogany desk and approached a reinforced steel wall safe hidden behind an abstract painting. He punched in a complex 12-digit passcode, spun the heavy dial, and pulled out a Faraday cage box. He popped the latches and carefully lifted out a thick, outdated magnetic hard drive. Its metal casing was heavily scratched, and the exposed connection pins were tarnished with age. He placed it deliberately on the glass desk in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice raspy from the sprint. "You said the terminal was at the vault. This is the physical key to that terminal." Thorne replied, his eyes dark with the weight of decades-old secrets. "But more importantly, it is the only remaining artifact of a man named Arthur Vance." I stared at him, the name meaning absolutely nothing to me. Arthur Vance was a pioneer in algorithmic architecture. Thorne continued, his voice perfectly steady. "He was also your biological father." The walls of the office seemed to tilt violently. The ambient hum of the city traffic outside faded into a sharp ringing in my ears. I gripped the edge of the glass desk to stabilize myself. "Donovan is not my blood. Donovan Sinclair is a parasite who married your mother when you were an infant," Thorne stated flatly. "Arthur was a brilliant software engineer. He built the foundational source code that Donovan later stole, rebranded, and used to launch Sentinel Technologies. When Arthur discovered the intellectual theft and threatened to expose him, Donovan weaponized his corporate lawyers. He framed Arthur for massive corporate embezzlement, fabricating a paper trail so digitally damning it guaranteed a federal prison sentence. Your father was forced to flee the country in the middle of the night. He died overseas, penniless and disgraced, completely severed from you." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. It made terrifying, flawless sense. It explained Donovan's inherent disgust whenever he looked at me. It explained Camilla's icy complicity. It explained my natural, instinctive grasp of complex data architecture and forensic coding. It was not a fluke or a learned trait. It was pure genetics. I was looking at the physical manifestation of my stolen heritage. "Grandma Beatrice discovered the truth 5 years ago," Thorne explained, tapping the scarred metal casing of the hard drive. "She utilized her own private investigators to track down Arthur's original workstation and extracted this drive. It contains the raw, uncompiled source code of his life's work. But the drive is heavily corrupted. The data sectors are severely fragmented. Donovan attempted to wipe it magnetically before Arthur escaped." "Why give it to me now?" I asked, my fingers gently tracing the cold metal of the drive. "Why not just leave me the decryption key for the trust?" "Because Beatrice Sinclair despised unearned wealth," Thorne said, checking his heavy silver watch. "She wanted you to inherit the $25 million, but she demanded you prove you are truly Arthur Vance's daughter to claim it. The biometric lock at the manufacturing vault requires a compiled, flawless version of this exact code. You have to use your forensic capabilities to repair the corrupted sectors, bridge the fragmented logic sequences, and compile the master key. It is her way of ensuring you reclaim your true intellectual legacy." "It is currently 10:15, Thorne stated, pointing to the digital clock glowing on his wall. "If the code is not repaired and executed at the vault terminal by midnight, the trust automatically dissolves into a charitable foundation. You have less than 2 hours to resurrect a ghost." I did not waste time processing the emotional shockwave. Grieving the father I never knew would have to wait. I pulled my high-processing iPad from my clutch and snapped a multi-port adapter cable into the base. I connected the other end to the archaic pins of the damaged hard drive. I dropped into Thorne's leather chair and fired up a deep-level hexadecimal editor. The screen immediately flooded with glowing red error warnings. The drive was a digital war zone. Entire blocks of memory had been magnetically scrambled, leaving gaping holes in the logic pathways. But as I scrolled rapidly through the fragmented lines of raw C++ and assembly language, a profound, undeniable sense of familiarity washed over me. This was the skeleton of Sentinel. Donovan had layered thousands of lines of bloated corporate code over it, but the core engine, the brilliant, elegant predictive algorithm, was entirely Arthur Vance. It was my father. I began to type, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard with blistering speed. I bypassed the dead sectors, writing custom bridge scripts to reconnect the orphaned data packets. I was not just repairing code, I was having a conversation with a dead man. I understood his logic intuitively. I anticipated his structural decisions. Where Donovan saw a complex maze of numbers, I saw a beautifully designed puzzle. Every line I restored felt like reclaiming a piece of my own identity. He built a recursive loop here, I murmured, my eyes scanning the dense blocks of text. Donovan could never figure out how to stabilize it, so he just throttled the processing speed. But Arthur did not throttle it. He meant for it to self-correct. I rewrote the damaged loop, patching the syntax error with a streamlined command protocol. I was sweating, the adrenaline burning through my veins as the digital clock on Thorne's wall ticked past 11:30. I had 30 minutes to finish the compilation and physically reach the vault. I ran a master diagnostic. The progress bar crawled across the screen in agonizingly slow increments. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Green. The code stabilized. I slammed my finger against the execute command, initiating the final compilation. The terminal hummed, processing the repaired data. A single, flawless cryptographic key generated on my screen. I severed the connection, downloaded the key directly to my secure local drive, and ripped the adapter cable out. I have it, I said, grabbing my clutch. Thorne tossed a set of heavy brass keys across the desk. The vault is beneath the old textile factory on 9th Avenue. Go. The vault is beneath the old textile factory on 9th Avenue. Go. I did not waste a fraction of a second. I bolted out of Elias Thorne's office, shedding the remnants of my ruined silk dress as I hit the street. The rain had intensified, washing away the chaos of the gala, leaving only the sharp, cold reality of the concrete beneath my feet. I sprinted the 4 blocks to 9th Avenue, my lungs burning, my mind entirely detached from the physical pain. The old textile factory was a decaying monolith of brick and rusted steel. I navigated the darkened alleyway, found the heavy iron service door, and shoved the brass key into the lock. It turned with a harsh metallic grind. I threw my weight against the iron, slipping inside and engaging my phone's flashlight. I bypassed the abandoned ground floor, heading straight for the subterranean stairwell. 3 flights down, the air turned frigid, smelling heavily of ozone and undisturbed dust. At the end of a long concrete corridor stood a massive reinforced steel bulkhead, the Sinclair manufacturing vault. I swiped the keycard Thorne had provided. The heavy hydraulic bolts retracted with a deep, resonating thud, and the vault door swung open. Inside was a climate-controlled server room dominated by an archaic, isolated mainframe. I moved to the central console and slammed my go bag onto the metal grating. I pulled out my rescued servers, the high-capacity processing rigs I had salvaged from my apartment just before Donovan's men could destroy them. I daisy-chained them together, creating a localized, high-powered processing cluster. The digital clock on the vault's primary monitor flipped. It glared in sharp red LED digits, 11 p.m. Exactly 60 minutes before the final protocol permanently locked the $25 million and defaulted the trust to a charity. I pulled the heavily scarred magnetic hard drive Thorne had given me, my biological father's original drive, and wired it into my rescued servers using a custom SATA to USB bridge. The second the connection went live, the mainframe's defensive architecture engaged. It was not a simple password prompt. It was a hostile digital environment designed to completely neutralize unauthorized access. A shrill warning alarm blared from my diagnostic terminal. The physical hard drive was failing. Decades of magnetic degradation were catching up. The read-write heads were grinding against the platters. Sectors of data were dying in real time. If the drive crashed before I could extract the uncompiled base code and push it into the mainframe, the money was gone forever. There was no room for panic. There was no space for an emotional monologue about the father I never knew. I dropped into a state of absolute surgical focus. This was pure action, pure mechanics. I bypassed the graphical user interface entirely, dropping straight into the command line terminal. I initiated a bit-for-bit forensic clone, deploying a low-level data recovery script. I needed to mirror the failing drive directly onto my solid-state array before the physical hardware disintegrated. The screen blurred into a cascading waterfall of alphanumeric data. Error blocks flashed yellow, then a critical red. The drive was hemorrhaging information. I isolated the corrupted sectors, manually redirecting the read heads to scrape the healthy data blocks first. It was digital triage. I applied every forensic data recovery technique I had painstakingly mastered over the past decade. While Camilla was busy ignoring me to host sovereign grand galas, I was in my bedroom tearing apart dead hard drives. While Donovan was grooming Blair to be the heir to a fraudulent empire, I was studying hexadecimal editors, packet sniffers, and deep-level encryption protocols. They had left me in the shadows, and in the shadows, I had forged myself into a weapon. 11:22 p.m. The drive cloning hit 50%, but the vault's internal firewall detected the extraction anomaly. It immediately threw up a polymorphic encryption shield, scrambling the incoming data stream. The code began mutating every 10 seconds, actively fighting my connection. I recognized the architecture instantly. It was a shifting cipher, a complex mathematical puzzle relying on randomized prime number generation. It was my biological father's signature defense mechanism. To break it, I had to anticipate it. I opened a secondary terminal window and began writing an aggressive counterscript from scratch. My fingers struck the keys with bruising rhythmic force. I built an algorithmic net designed to predict the cipher's next mutation based on the previous variable shifts. I was not fighting the machine. I was matching his logic, step for step, line by line. 11:41 p.m. A terrifying mechanical click of death echoed from the exposed hard drive. The read arm was failing, scratching the delicate magnetic platter. I had to throttle the spin speed, risking a significantly slower data transfer rate to prevent a catastrophic hardware crash. I ripped the casing off one of my rescued servers and routed the heavy-duty cooling fans directly over the dying drive, drastically dropping its ambient temperature to stabilize the fragile circuits. 11:51 p.m. My counterscript caught the polymorphic cipher. The encryption shield shattered. I locked the decryption key and forced the mainframe's handshake protocol open. The system demanded the final sequence, the fully compiled code bridging my father's original logic with the vault's master lock. I initiated the final payload injection. The raw data stream surged through the patched, fragile connection. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 90%, 95%, 11:58 p.m. The failing hard drive shrieked a high-pitched, agonizing mechanical whine. A spark shot from the exposed circuitry. The drive died completely, the internal disks grinding to a hard, permanent halt. The connection severed. My diagnostic screens went totally black. Silence crashed down into the vault. My chest heaved as I stared at the dark reflective glass of the mainframe monitor. My heavy breathing was the only sound left in the room. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the primary monitor flared back to life, bathing the cold steel room in a brilliant, blinding green light. A single line of text appeared in the center of the screen. Handshake confirmed. Biometric lock disengaged. Trust assets unfrozen. The $25 million was secured. The code was unbroken. The legacy was mine. The blinding green light of the mainframe bathed the concrete walls of the vault. I did not waste a single second celebrating. Unfreezing the assets was only the first half of the operation. The capital was now vulnerable, sitting exposed in a transitional clearinghouse account. If the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Internal Revenue Service flagged the sudden movement of a dormant $25 million trust, they could freeze the routing protocol before the funds settled. My fingers flew across the glass surface of my customized tablet. I initiated a pre-written distribution script I had designed weeks ago. I was not going to let the money sit in a single vulnerable target. I triggered a decentralized routing sequence. The screen displayed a real-time geographic map of offshore financial nodes, Swiss banking proxies, Cayman Island holding companies, encrypted digital ledgers. The $25 million fractured into thousands of microtransactions, scrambling across the globe in a chaotic, untraceable web of digital noise before seamlessly reassembling in my heavily insulated primary accounts. The transfer progress bar hit 100%. A secondary confirmation window popped up displaying the final aggregate balance. The transfer of the $25 million had officially cleared into my secure accounts. The financial freedom was absolute. I leaned back against the cold steel of the vault console, allowing myself a single deep exhalation of relief. For my entire life, Donovan and Camilla had used their immense wealth as a bludgeon. They had controlled the narrative, dictated the rules of engagement, and smothered anyone who dared to step out of line. Money was their weapon, their absolute shield, and their religion. Now I held the sword. I was entirely untouchable. I possessed the capital to launch my own legitimate technology firm, to hire the most vicious corporate litigators on the eastern seaboard, and to ensure that my biological father's stolen legacy was properly restored and fiercely protected. I looked down at the ruined, smoking hard drive resting on top of my server rack. The faint smell of burnt ozone and melting plastic hung in the stale subterranean air. Arthur Vance was gone, but his genius had just saved my life. I carefully disconnected the tangled web of adapter cables, packed my surviving hardware back into my heavy canvas go bag, and gently placed the fried metallic carcass of my father's drive into a padded anti-static pouch. It belonged to me now. I hoisted the heavy bag over my shoulder and walked out of the server room. The massive steel bulkhead groaned loudly as I engaged the manual hydraulic seal, locking the empty manufacturing vault securely behind me. I climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs, my muscles aching the sheer exhaustion of the past 48 hours, finally threatening to crash down on my nervous system. I pushed open the heavy iron service door and stepped out into the damp alleyway on 9th Avenue. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective under the harsh glare of the sodium street lamps. The distant wail of police sirens echoed through the city canyons, a lingering reminder of the chaos still unfolding at the Sovereign Grand Hotel. The federal authorities would be spending the next several days ripping apart Donovan's offshore shell companies, but they would find absolutely nothing connected to me. My tracks were scrubbed entirely clean. I walked 2 blocks north, the cold night air biting through the torn fabric of my ruined gala dress. I reached a quiet 24-hour coffee shop, the neon sign buzzing erratically above the door. I needed caffeine and a secure wireless connection to begin drafting the incorporation documents for my new firm. I stepped inside the bell above the door, chiming softly. The tired barista barely glanced up from his magazine. I ordered a black espresso, paid with a crisp bill from my clutch, and took a seat in the darkest corner booth facing the entrance. I pulled out my secondary encrypted phone, ready to message Kendrick and confirm the capital extraction was successful. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. Suddenly, the device vibrated violently against the wooden table. I stared at the incoming call display. It was a completely restricted number. Nobody had this direct dial access except Elias Thorne and my closest digital security proxies. My tactical instincts flared instantly. I placed my coffee cup down and answered the call, holding the phone cautiously to my ear without speaking. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the county jail," the automated robotic voice recited. "Press 1 to accept the charges." A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Donovan would never call me. He would be too busy demanding access to his high-priced defense attorneys. I pressed the digit on the glass screen. The line clicked, followed by a heavy blast of static and the hollow, echoing acoustics of a concrete holding cell. "You think you have won," Camilla's voice hissed through the speaker. It was not the polished, condescending tone of a wealthy socialite. It was venomous, ragged, and dripping with raw, unadulterated malice. She sounded entirely unhinged, the mask of the perfect matriarch completely ripped away by the reality of law enforcement custody. "You think you are so brilliant, Sydney." Camilla spat her breath, catching harshly on the prison microphone. "You think because you seized that precious little trust fund you are untouchable. You think you get to walk away and play the triumphant survivor while we rot in a concrete box. You are in a concrete box because of your own boundless greed." "Camilla," I replied, my voice perfectly level, refusing to give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. "The federal government has your complete offshore routing history. You are facing 20 years for wire fraud. I highly suggest you save your breath for your arraignment hearing." Camilla let out a sharp, grating laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. It was the sound of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "You think you've won?" Camilla whispered, her tone shifting from rage to a dark, triumphant glee. "You don't know what I hid inside the walls of that guest house." I frowned, my hand tightening around the phone. The guest house on the Sinclair estate had been my isolated prison for years. It was where they had banished me, keeping me entirely out of sight from their elite social circle. "What are you talking about?" "The feds are raiding the primary estate right now," Camilla taunted, her voice rising in a frantic, chaotic crescendo. "They are bringing the sledgehammers. They are pulling up the floorboards. When the feds find it, you're going down with us." The line went dead with a sharp mechanical click, leaving nothing but a dial tone echoing in the quiet coffee shop. I lowered the phone from my ear. The dial tone buzzed like an angry hornet in the quiet coffee shop. Camilla's threat was not an empty bluff. It was a desperate, calculated strike from a drowning woman who wanted to ensure I was pulled under the water right alongside her. I did not waste a single second succumbing to panic. I pulled up my encrypted contact list and dialed the direct line for Special Agent Thomas Miller, the lead investigator for the FBI Financial Crimes Division, orchestrating the Sinclair raid. He answered on the second ring. The chaotic sounds of shouting agents and heavy boots echoed loudly in the background of his audio feed. I relayed Camilla's exact words without any hesitation. I instructed Miller to pull his primary tactical team back from the main mansion and redirect them immediately to the guest house on the south lawn. I bolted from the coffee shop, leaving the untouched espresso on the table. I flagged down a passing taxi, shoved a $100 bill through the partition, and barked the address of the Sinclair estate. The drive through the city was a blur of rain-slicked streets and flashing traffic lights. When I arrived at the towering wrought iron gates of the estate, the property was swarming with federal authorities. Black tactical vehicles were parked haphazardly across the pristine manicured driveway. Red and blue emergency lights painted the wet foliage in harsh alternating colors. I bypassed the palatial main house entirely. I sprinted across the soaked grass toward the small, isolated guest house that had served as my prison for so many years. Agent Miller was already waiting on the wooden porch, flanked by 3 heavily armed federal agents carrying steel breaching tools. I directed the team straight inside. The guest house was a single-story structure, cramped and neglected. I walked purposefully to the small bedroom. I knew every inch of this miserable space. If Camilla had hidden something highly incriminating, she would place it exactly where she knew I spent the vast majority of my time, ensuring the physical proximity directly implicated me. I pointed a steady finger at the blank wall directly behind where my headboard used to sit. "Tear it open," I commanded. Miller gave a sharp nod. An agent stepped forward and swung a heavy iron pry bar violently into the plaster. White dust plumed into the air as thick chunks of drywall shattered and crashed to the hardwood floor. He struck the wall again, ripping away the wooden studs and exposing the dark insulation. Deep inside the wall cavity, resting precariously on a wooden crossbeam, sat a small fireproof lockbox. Miller pulled the heavy box free from the debris. He snapped the flimsy brass lock with a pair of tactical bolt cutters and threw open the lid. Inside the protective casing rested a pristine leather-bound physical accounting ledger alongside a sleek black solid-state hard drive. Miller flipped open the heavy physical ledger. His expression hardened into a severe scowl as his eyes scanned the pages. He handed the book directly to me. The pages were filled with meticulously recorded transactions written in neat columns. Camilla had constructed a masterfully fabricated paper trail. She had taken the meager monthly rent checks I had been forced to pay them for the privilege of living in the guest house and doctored the accounting records to make it look like those checks were actually massive regular deposits into Donovan's primary money laundering shell companies. The narrative she was attempting to spin to the authorities was brilliantly lethal. She was framing me as a willing and active co-conspirator. The ledger made it appear as though I had been deliberately funneling illicit capital through my personal bank accounts to wash the syndicate's dirty money. If this physical evidence holds up in court, Miller stated, his voice grim and highly professional, the United States Attorney will have absolutely no choice but to indict you as a managing partner in the Sinclair fraud. This establishes a direct financial footprint linking you to their offshore accounts. Camilla was trying to drag me into a federal penitentiary. It was a vindictive, flawless frame job. But Camilla was arrogant, and arrogance always breeds technical sloppiness. It will not hold up, I said, dropping the heavy leather ledger onto the mattress. Physical ledgers are nothing but theatrical props. The FBI requires digital verification for federal wire fraud indictments. Pass me that hard drive. I unzipped my heavy canvas go bag and pulled out my high-processing forensic tablet. I connected the black solid-state drive to my rig, routing the connection through a secure, localized sandbox environment to prevent any malicious counterscripts from executing and infecting my hardware. The hidden drive mounted successfully on my screen. It contained the exact digital twins of the physical ledger pages, complete with offshore banking routing numbers and complex transaction hashes. To the untrained eye of a standard auditor, it looked like a devastating decade-long record of my absolute complicity in the Sinclair criminal syndicate. I bypassed the surface-level data entirely and drilled straight down into the fundamental file architecture. I initiated a deep-level metadata extraction script. Metadata never lies. It records the exact digital heartbeat of a file, including the creation date, the modification history, and the specific machine registry that originally authored the code. The terminal screen flooded with lines of raw diagnostic output. I isolated the core directory containing the fabricated rent check transactions. I highlighted the digital creation timestamps and turned the glowing screen toward Agent Miller. Look at the master sequence, I stated, tapping the glass firmly. These files were not created over a 10-year period. The creation timestamps for every single document on this drive are absolutely identical. Miller leaned in close, his eyes narrowing as he read the glowing green text scrolling across the monitor. The metadata proved undeniably that the entire digital ledger had been generated, compiled, and saved exactly 48 hours ago. Camilla had not been keeping a long-term record of my involvement. She had panicked when she realized the empire was collapsing around her and hastily forged the entire paper trail 2 days prior to the Sovereign Grand Gala. She was desperately trying to construct a convenient scapegoat at the 11th hour. Furthermore, I continued, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. I ran a quick registry cross-reference on the authoring machine's media access control address. The specific hardware signature attached to these forged files matches the exact Internet Protocol routing of Camilla Sinclair's personal desktop computer located inside the main mansion. I looked up at the federal agent, a cold, hard satisfaction settling deep in my chest. She did not just fabricate federal evidence, she digitally signed her own forgery. Miller let out a low, impressed whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. He pulled a clear plastic evidence bag from his tactical jacket and carefully slid both the solid-state hard drive and the physical leather ledger inside. "This is not a frame job anymore," Sidney Miller said, sealing the evidence bag with a sharp, decisive zip. "This is textbook obstruction of justice. Fabricating federal evidence carries a mandatory minimum sentence." Camilla had thought she was leaving a hidden landmine that would utterly destroy my newly won financial freedom. Instead, She had unknowingly handed the federal prosecutors the exact ammunition they needed to bury her completely. By trying to drag me down with her, Camilla Sinclair had just guaranteed herself the absolute maximum federal prison sentence. The remnants of their fraudulent empire were now completely and permanently erased. I stood in the ruined guest house, surrounded by federal agents and shattered drywall, knowing that for the first time in my life, I was finally truly free. The air inside the federal courthouse felt entirely different from the damp, oppressive atmosphere of the ruined guest house. It was 6 months later, and the relentless wheels of the justice system had ground the Sinclair empire into fine dust. I sat in the back row of the gallery, wearing a tailored charcoal suit paid for by the Vance Trust, and watched as the judge delivered the final sentencing. Donovan Sinclair stood at the defense table, stripped of his custom Italian suits, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely erased, replaced by a hollow, sunken vacancy. His hands trembled as he gripped the wooden edge of the table. The judge did not mince words. He cited the sheer magnitude of the offshore wire fraud, the blatant exploitation of intellectual property, and the egregious obstruction of justice facilitated by Camilla's forged ledger. The physical and digital evidence I had handed over to Agent Miller was insurmountable. Donovan received 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Camilla, sobbing loudly and attempting to feign a sudden medical emergency in a desperate bid for sympathy, was handed 20 years. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. It was the sound of absolute finality. The federal government immediately moved to fully liquidate their remaining assets. The sprawling Sinclair estate, the fleet of luxury vehicles, the private jets, and every offshore account not already drained by their massive legal defense team were seized by the Internal Revenue Service. The properties were systematically auctioned off to compensate the investors they had defrauded over the decades. I watched them being led away in heavy steel handcuffs, feeling absolutely no remorse. The monsters of my childhood were finally locked inside concrete boxes of their own making. The spectacular collapse of the Sinclair syndicate did not just isolate Donovan and Camilla. It completely eradicated the golden safety net that had protected my sister Blair her entire life. Blair had built her entire identity on the illusion of inherited superiority and limitless wealth. When the federal asset freeze hit, her reality violently shattered. Her husband, a wealthy venture capitalist who had married her purely for the Sinclair social cachet and political connections, filed for divorce the exact same day the federal indictments were unsealed. He deployed a team of vicious corporate lawyers to completely insulate his own assets, executing an ironclad prenuptial agreement that left Blair with absolutely nothing. She was suddenly buried under a mountain of legal debts from her frantic attempts to untangle herself from her parents' corporate fraud. The bank swiftly foreclosed on her sprawling suburban mansion, locking her out with only a single suitcase of belongings. The repo men arrived in the middle of the night to tow away her prized Mercedes and Range Rover. With her trust funds frozen and her elite socialite friends instantly abandoning her to avoid the toxic association, Blair was forced to face the real world without a financial shield. 6 weeks later, I walked past a high-end luxury retail boutique in the financial district. Through the polished plate glass window, I saw her. Blair was wearing a standard-issue employee uniform. Her posture slumped as she folded cashmere sweaters on a display table. She looked exhausted, her previously flawless makeup absent, her expression worn down by the harsh reality of minimum-wage retail shifts and crushing financial liability. She was currently organizing a rack of scarves while a demanding customer berated her for moving too slowly. She glanced up and our eyes met through the glass. Her face paled, a flash of profound humiliation crossing her features as she realized I was watching her perform manual labor. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply maintained eye contact for 3 solid seconds, acknowledging the absolute shift in our realities before turning and walking away. Karma had delivered its own flawless verdict. My own professional vindication arrived shortly after the Sinclair sentencings. The fallout from the federal investigation had a massive ripple effect, reaching all the way back to the corporate marketing firm that had unceremoniously fired me months prior. During the discovery phase of Donovan's trial, federal agents unearthed a series of highly encrypted emails between Donovan and my former human resources director. The correspondence proved definitively that my termination had been a calculated act of corporate sabotage. Donovan had actively bribed the HR director to fabricate performance issues and push me out, orchestrating the firing to neutralize my financial independence and force me back under his control. The revelation sent shockwaves through the corporate sector. The HR director was immediately fired by the board of directors, escorted out of the building by security, and placed under active investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for accepting illicit corporate bribes. The scandal threatened to completely tank the firm's stock price and ruin their industry reputation. I was sitting in my newly leased penthouse office overlooking the downtown skyline, reviewing the blueprints for my own technology firm when my secure line rang. It was the chief executive officer of my former firm. His tone was frantic, dripping with forced humility and desperate damage control. He spent 5 straight minutes apologizing profusely, claiming he had been completely blind to the HR director's illegal actions and the internal sabotage. He offered me a position as a senior executive, promising a massive signing bonus, full creative control over the entire department, and a public apology issued directly on the company letterhead. He was terrified of a retaliatory wrongful termination lawsuit and was trying to buy my silence with a shiny new title and corporate perks. I let him finish his desperate sweating pitch, listening to his breathing hitch over the receiver. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my own empire built with Arthur Vance's restored capital and my own relentless intellect. I did not need his job. I did not need his validation. My response was cold, precise, and absolute. I declined the offer, informed him my legal team would be pursuing maximum financial damages for the wrongful termination, and ended the call without waiting for his response. I placed the phone face down on my polished obsidian desk. The silence in my penthouse office was absolute, a perfect reflection of my newly established reality. That single phone call officially severed the final invisible string tying me to my past. 6 months passed since the federal authorities dismantled the Sinclair syndicate. I did not allow the dust to settle before executing my own master plan. The $25 million from Arthur Vance's trust had not just been a windfall. It was the foundational bedrock of Vanguard Forensic Systems. I purchased the top 3 floors of a towering glass high-rise in the city's tech district. The space was a fortress of innovation stripped of corporate bloat and designed for absolute efficiency. The server rooms hummed with state-of-the-art predictive algorithms, quantum processing clusters, and custom-built defensive networks. The core engine powering my firm was heavily adapted from my biological father's original uncompiled source code. I had taken his brilliant recursive logic and weaponized it for the modern digital battlefield. I recruited the sharpest, most relentless cybersecurity minds in the country. We were no longer hidden assets working in the shadows. I was the chief executive of an elite data defense firm. We specialized in dismantling the exact type of corporate fraud that Donovan Sinclair had perfected. My firm audited the untouchable, exposed hidden ledgers and shattered the digital illusions of corrupt billionaires. When global corporations suspected internal sabotage, they called Vanguard. When federal agencies needed complex cryptographic locks broken, they requested my specific authorization. I had weaponized my trauma, transforming the forensic skills I honed in the guest house into a legitimate, terrifyingly effective empire. My new status placed me directly in the center of the city's legitimate power brokers. That included Julian Kendrick. The fallout from the Sinclair collapse had initially sent shockwaves through the market, threatening to permanently stall his technology firm's initial public offering. But Julian was a survivor. Without Donovan's shadow network actively throttling his infrastructure, Kendrick rebounded with aggressive precision. He utilized independent forensic auditors to meticulously scrub his data architecture completely, clearing his company's name and severing all remaining ties to the Sinclair shell companies. His legally restructured IPO launched flawlessly shattering market projections within the first hour of trading. We no longer met in hushed clandestine hotel lobbies or communicated through heavily encrypted chat rooms. We met for coffee every other Tuesday at a bright, bustling cafe near the financial district. I walked in wearing a sharply tailored suit, meeting him at our usual table near the window. He looked rested, the deep stress lines around his eyes entirely gone. We sat in the open drinking dark roast coffee and exchanging industry intelligence as respected colleagues. He asked for my perspective on a new decentralized ledger protocol, and I offered a brutal, honest critique of its security flaws. There was no romance, no lingering debts, and no power imbalance. It was a partnership forged in the fires of mutual survival, built on absolute professional respect. He raised his ceramic mug, clinking it against mine in a silent, enduring salute to the empires we had both secured. Later that afternoon, the crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks as I drove my matte black sports car through the heavy wrought iron gates of the Mount Auburn Cemetery. The sprawling Sinclair family plot was an ostentatious display of marble and granite monuments. Even in death, Donovan's ancestors demanded to project dominance and superiority. I bypassed the towering, gaudy mausoleums and walked along the winding cobblestone path. My destination was set far apart from the main family, holding resting quietly under the sprawling branches of a massive weeping willow. Grandma Beatrice Sinclair. I stopped in front of the modest, polished headstone. I stood perfectly still, letting the biting wind rush past me. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I had left that identity behind in the ruins of the guest house. I carried a single bouquet of white lilies. I knelt on the damp grass and placed the flowers carefully against the gray stone base. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady and carrying softly through the quiet cemetery. "Thank you for making me earn it. Thank you for forcing me to find the truth." Beatrice Sinclair had always seen through the manufactured glamour of her own family. She knew Donovan was a parasite, and she knew I was the collateral damage of his violent greed. But she had not handed me the $25 million out of blind affection or simple pity. She had given me a crucible. Leaving the uncompiled, corrupted hard drive as the only key to the vault was a brutal, flawless test. She needed to ensure I possessed the sheer will, the relentless intellect, and the forensic capability required to carry Arthur Vance's legacy forward. She made me resurrect a ghost to prove I was worthy of the future. She gave me the tools to shatter my own chains. I stood up, brushing the stray damp leaves from my knees, and pulled my trench coat tighter around my shoulders. I looked at the name carved into the stone one last time, feeling a profound sense of closure. The Sinclair shadow was permanently erased. The fear, the isolation, the constant crushing weight of being the family disappointment was gone. I was no longer the discarded daughter of a toxic dynasty. I was the architect of my own empire, forged in the fires of my stolen heritage, operating entirely on my own terms. I turned my back on the graves and walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing with absolute certainty. Sometimes a family's rejection isn't an ending, it's the ultimate liberation to build your own empire. Have you ever had to use your own skills to shatter the lies of toxic relatives? Let me know your story in the comments below.